I want to give a few minutes just for everybody to get on here, and then we will get started as soon as possible. Again, thanks so much for everybody that's able to make it today. If there are any questions about the link, it should have come out in the most recent Eventbrite email as well. So if you have coworkers or other folks that are having a hard time accessing the webinar, if you're registered through Eventbrite, all of the Eventbrite updates should have that same Zoom link in it. So you should be able to access it from there. Again, we'll get started in, we'll go with about 9:05. We'll try and make sure we're on the road ready to go. Again, thanks so much for everybody being here today. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I know that there's still some folks filtering through. We're not going to get started quite yet. We'll give it a couple of minutes just for everybody to get on the call. I just wanted to thank everybody again for being here today. Appreciate you giving up your time to try and come and learn a little bit more about human trafficking with us. Again, if you haven't had the opportunity before, everything that we're going to talk about today is building on Human Trafficking 101 that we did last fall. That video link is available. If you don't have it, please feel free to reach out to us. If you haven't seen it, please take the time. It is a great learning resource. We're very happy to have that available. It's on our website as well. At this point, I do want to take a moment and thank the Central Huron Donation Fund for making this webinar series possible. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges and a lot that goes into making this training available, especially hopefully free of cost to everybody, and trying to get that information out there. So we do want to thank them for making this possible. We will get started in about 5 minutes. I just want to give everybody an opportunity to get on. Again, you'll see that your chat function is disabled for today. We'll go through some quick housekeeping stuff right at the start of the training, but if you do have anything that pops up, please feel free to throw it into the question and answer, and we'll try and get to it the best we can. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started in about a minute here. I just want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get on. Again, there is no concern if the people are not on right away, if they do have to join partway through or leave early. We will make sure that this training that is being recorded, we'll send it out to everybody as soon as possible. So there shouldn't be any concern in that regard. Everybody that is registered for the event will absolutely get a recording. They'll get all of the documents that we talk about during this training. And then any questions or any follow-up can also happen as well. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started today. If you do want to rename yourself, if you're using your corporate account for Zoom or anything like that, if you do have specific questions, please feel free to rename yourself with your name and agency. We are recording this session for training purposes in the future and to make it available for folks who couldn't be here today. Again, everybody here today should not have access to their microphone, should not have access to their camera, and shouldn't be able to actually use the chat function on Zoom. But what we do have available for today is a question and answer function. So if you do have a question, please feel free to throw it in the question and answer boxes. We will periodically try and get to them along the way. I will monitor them. If we don't answer your question live today, we will get back to you as soon as we can with an answer. We do want to make sure that we're giving you the best possible information we can. Again, we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Please feel free, whether it's while I'm presenting during the panel portion of today, throw your questions in the chat because we do want to get this information out there. We do want some level of interactive component with this training. The other thing is I know that there might be some folks that are sharing a screen today. If you have multiple people that are in the same organization, please feel free to send us an email at info@victimservices.huron.ca. And we are happy to issue certificates for today's training. We want to give you some credit for the amount of time that you're putting in. This is good information. We do hope that there's some value to it. Please reach out to us. Please let us know if there are multiple people signed in from the same screen. We will get ready here to go here in just about 1 minute's time. Again, thank you so much for being here. A special thanks to the Central Huron Donation Fund for making this training available to everybody. We really do appreciate it, and we are looking forward to get going. We'll go in just shy of a minute. But again, if there are any questions, if there are any struggles rejoining, please don't worry about it. We will send out a recording of the entire session with all of the questions and go from there. All right, I think we are going to get started for today. I really appreciate everybody signing on. I know there's a lot of participants here today. We had over 150 people register for this session, so I really appreciate everybody making themselves available. We are hopeful that this session is beneficial and provides some good information. We are again building on what we talked about during Human Trafficking 101. If there's any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We will go from there. With that being said, I do like to start every training with the same thing. We do need to cover the fact that there is a land acknowledgement that should be performed. And with that, Victim Services of Huron County acknowledges that the geographic area that we support is located on the traditional lands of the Ojibwe Chippewa of the Anishinaabe group of Indigenous peoples. Huron County is on territory that is covered by Crown Treaty number 29, known as the Huron Tract Purchase of 1827. As a community, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. We recognize and deeply appreciate the Indigenous historic connection to this place and the agreement with the Crown of Canada to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. So without any further ado, we are going to jump into our first little piece of the session here today. I do like to go over a brief outline of what we are hoping to cover. Again, we are building on everything that we talked about from Human Trafficking 101. So we will go over some of those concepts briefly. If you haven't seen that video, if you haven't gone through that training initially with us last fall, it is available on our website. It is available to be viewed, and please feel free to reach out because we do want to make sure that everybody has a strong foundation that we're building on when it comes to human trafficking. We're also going to start to look at our understanding of human trafficking today. From a statistical standpoint, there's a lot of things that we're seeing that are concerning along the way. And I do think that there is something to be said for being able to show some numbers that start to back up some of these situations. When we've been talking about how important human trafficking is, to be able to put that in a numerical standpoint is something that can help a lot of people to understand. From that, we're also going to look at some of the signs, symptoms, and red flags when it comes to human trafficking and some of the really important things that we should be looking for as stakeholders, things that we should be aware of, things that we might see in our clients, things that we might see out in the community, whether it's in our personal lives or professional, things that might be important. I do want to talk in depth about the human trafficking disclosure process because that is something that is very, very important and something that we often see a lot of situations that come out of the disclosure process. We are going to start to look at managing timelines around human trafficking cases. Some of you will have seen our Pathways to Safety document before. I will touch on it briefly, and we will send it out after the fact with the recording for this session. So we will look at how we manage timelines when there might be an increased need for support from stakeholders and what we can do to support that. And then I'm actually going to give out some hopefully useful information on how we can actually create a successful path to intervention when it comes to human trafficking cases. What are our takeaways? What are the important things that we want to learn when we're trying to build on that fundamental understanding of human trafficking and set ourselves up for success as much as possible? Then we're actually going to finish with a quick panel session. We have some incredible people that have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience when it comes to human trafficking. And we're hopeful to get to ask them some questions, answer some questions, and provide a bit of insight into their perspectives when it comes to human trafficking along the way. So as I had mentioned, we are building on the HT 101 that we did last fall. From that, there are a couple takeaways that I think are incredibly important for us to hit on along the way. The first thing that I always want to recap when we're doing these sessions is to understand that human trafficking is not a linear process. We often think of it as step A, step B, step C, step 1, 2, 3, something that has to fall in a chronological order. We should understand at this point as stakeholders that human trafficking is nothing but linear. It is not even close to our understanding of that straightforward, easy to go through process. It is something that the steps don't make sense. It is cyclical in nature. It's like walking through that hay bale maze. It's very difficult for us to understand where we start at one point and we might loop back to that point. It is not a start to finish process. Sometimes we end up back at that finish line before we even get going. There are other times where we end up back at the start without even realizing. Human trafficking is not linear at all in nature. It needs to be understood that it can be quite difficult to understand and quite difficult to work through. The next thing that I want to focus on from that training is that traffickers can look like anyone. It is very easy for us to assign what we think a trafficker should look like based on what we see in TV, what we see in movies, that understanding of somebody who gives us the creeps, right? Traffickers can look like absolutely anyone, and that is something that we're really working on breaking through some of those stereotypes when it comes to the world of human trafficking, especially because it could be somebody, it could be your next door neighbor. It could be someone who's the same age, it could be same gender. Human trafficking does not discriminate in the sense that victims can look like anyone and traffickers can look like anyone. We go over in depth during HT 101 some of the human trafficking stages that happen. Again, if you're looking for a more in-depth breakdown of those stages, please refer back to that training. We talk about each of them in pretty good detail. With that being said, we do need to understand that there are clearly definable steps that will happen along the way that we can look for and see some of the red flags along the way to understand that those stages are occurring, and we can start to look for places to intervene along the way. The last thing is that I know that we have folks that are joining in from absolutely everywhere today. We have folks from Huron, Perth, Bruce, Grey, all the way down to Windsor, all the way north to Algoma. I know there's folks that are joining on an international level, but what I do want to say is that coming from a rural community, working in a rural community, we have this understanding or this belief that human trafficking might not be a problem that happens in our area. It might be an anomaly. We might see 1 or 2 cases a year. Unfortunately, the reality is that human trafficking does happen in our backyard. It happens in Huron, it happens in Bruce, it happens everywhere. It is not just a Toronto problem. It is not just an Ottawa problem. It is not just a major city issue. This is a rural problem that's happening in our backyard, and it's something that we need to start to take seriously as stakeholders and look for opportunities to address along the way. So, as I had mentioned, there are the stages of human trafficking that we had covered during HT 101. I know they are on a linear process today, and I know that I just said that it is not a linear process, but for sake of understanding, we do have to know that there's a timeline along the way. These stages can be moved around, shifted, replaced, and interchanged with each other, but I do want to make sure that we have an understanding of that all of these stages, or some of these stages, may occur during human trafficking cases along the way. So understanding that it generally begins with some form of luring. When it comes to luring, this can happen online, in person. Again, if you're looking for a more in-depth breakdown on what luring might look like, social media is a huge piece of it. We do cover all of these stages during HT 101, but it is important to understand that the luring and grooming and gaming period are quite a bit of a gray area. It's about the preparation of somebody and preparing them for a role in human trafficking, and understanding that this is often a chance for us to catch, as stakeholders, an opportunity to intervene before we get to a stage where things start to go wrong. This is what we might see as the honeymoon phase. We might see as some really positive things for those that might be victimized by human trafficking. But it is very important for us to understand at this point that the luring and the grooming and the gaming stages are very, very dangerous, because this is where we'll see the most resistance to access of services. Then we'll start to see things clearly take a shift and start to head in a negative direction. That's where we normally see the control and manipulation phase, and it's where we'll start to see some of these challenges along the way. When we start to see these pieces, again, control and manipulation can look like a lot of different things. For some people, it might be blackmail. For some people, it might be out and out coercion or threats. And for some people, it might be, they might not even be aware that they're being controlled or manipulated, and it might be an emotional state. It could be romantic. It could be financial. There's a lot of different components that go into it, but it is important to understand that this is where we'll start to see the turn, generally right before the exploitation of that individual. That is generally right before they're involved in human trafficking, in the exchange of any sort of service for financial benefit. That's where we'll start to see some of these issues along the way. The last stage, which we don't really talk about during HT 101, but I think is incredibly important and is new that we're starting to see more and more of, unfortunately, is a recruitment phase. This tends to come after the exploitation of an individual. And again, it sounds wildly inappropriate, and by no means am I saying that every human trafficking victim might hit this recruitment phase, but we are seeing situations where those who have been exploited, who have been through this ringer, who've been put through the cycle, are involved in the recruitment of the next generation of individuals who are going to be trafficked. Again, there's a number of different reasons why this happens. There's a number of pieces. Again, mostly for survival is the main reason that we're seeing it. But with that being said, we are seeing a recruitment piece that is being added somewhere along the way to keep that cycle of human trafficking flowing, whether it's involved with that individual or someone else down the road. At this point, I do have a quick video, and again, this is just meant to provide some perspective, a little bit of an insight into the world of human trafficking and the type of people that we're dealing with. Some of you might have seen this video before. This was a Toronto Star news piece that was covered regarding an offender who's currently incarcerated. Please feel free to take in how this individual is acting, how this individual is engaging with the general public, and understand that these are the type of people that we're seeing along the way. Again, we'll go through this video, and then I do want to try and build on that from there.
There's a dangerous game being played in Toronto and across the country. Romeo pimps who promise love and security, then enslave girls as young as 12. Moved up and down highways, from hotel to hotel and motel to motel. Matthew Diecko has played the game and he knows it well. Charged with trafficking, kidnapping, assault, forcible confinement. He awaits trial.
Sex is a part of life. I think a woman, if she wants to make money off it, she shouldn't have to go to jail or somebody that's helping her. It's her life. It's her body. Why should anybody be getting in trouble? Why should the Johns be getting arrested because they bought a woman? Some people don't want a relationship. They just want to get what they want and go home. No strings attached, no relation, no feelings, no fighting, no quick business deal.
How do you get a girl to fall in love with you and get a girl to be willing to do this?
It just happens. Like, most of these girls, like I said, they're broken. It's not hard. You just gotta answer their call. You get in there, you find the crack. Like, some are drugs, some are just, they need to hear I love you.
But if they just want someone to love them, this guy's not talking about loving her.
Oh, I know, but that's what she believes. It's the illusion. Be there for them. Tell them what they want to hear. You tell them, well, we need to put money away. I'm gonna do what I do. See, I'm putting my 50 in. You have to do your 50. So there's another way you can have sex with guys. But don't worry, I'm gonna love you. You know, I'm gonna go and sell drugs if that's what I'm doing on the side, or I'm gonna be making money and I'll be there to take care of you. At the end of the night, you're home with me. Every girl's had that fantasy wedding in that house with a pink fence. You sell it to her. She'll do it.
Why will she do it?
Because you just sold her a dream. Some of these girls are broken. It fixes them.
What fixes them?
Knowing someone out there cares. The illusion of it, right? Me, I don't let that happen. Because I'm not going to sit and lie to them and say, oh, I love you. I don't. I love my money.
And would you call that being a pimp?
No, I don't know what you would call it. Not a pimp. A manager.
So the unfortunate piece about this situation and with this video is I know that Matthew Diecko looks like that stereotypical bad person that we see in a movie. They look like a villain that they might see on a TV show or someone that we would fully expect to be labeled as a perpetrator when it comes to human trafficking. The reality of this, though, is that there are a number of individuals who don't look like Matthew Diecko and share that same opinion. They put very little emphasis or very little value on a human being. They put very little value on that individual's right to safety, their ability to function safely and live a proper life. They see it as a business transaction. He was very clear when he said that he doesn't love those people. He loves his money. And that is the reality, regardless of whether they look like Matthew Diecko or they don't. The reality is that these individuals who are perpetrating human trafficking have no regard for human life. They have regard for their own financial well-being. What I do want us all to take away is that mindset, right? When we're looking at traffickers, when we're looking at the folks that we're engaging with, that are being victimized, the person on the other end is someone who thinks like Matthew Diecko. That being said, they might not look like Matthew Diecko. They might be male, female, or identify otherwise. They could be 16 years old or 60 years old. Perpetrators of human trafficking, just like victims of human trafficking, can look like absolutely anyone. I do want us to start to get away because there is this perception out there that every trafficker is going to look like Matthew Diecko. But with that being said, Not every perpetrator is going to look like that, and not every victim is going to look like a stereotypical younger female victim. The numbers do say that we are looking at a specific population that might be targeted, but with that being said, we do need to be very aware that this can happen to absolutely anyone at any time, and anyone can be a perpetrator along the way. With that being said, the one thing that I do want us to take away from that video, from that entire conversation, is that human trafficking revolves around one thing and one thing only: the vulnerability of an individual. Vulnerability can manifest in a number of different ways. It looks different for absolutely everyone. What one person might be vulnerable about, another might not. Something like financials, right? Where our next meal is going to come from, what the roof over our head is going to be. That's not something that a lot of us might worry about, but it is for some. For others, it's going to look very different. It might be very emotional. It might be the need for love or affection, that desire to be cared for by an individual. There's also an entire subset of the population which unfortunately is relying on substances, right? That is a massive vulnerability. Access to substance and safety when using substance is a massive vulnerability that a huge percentage of the population works with. Another one is current personal connections. So the folks, the company that they're keeping, the folks that they know, the idea of having kids, the idea of having other family relationships that can be exploited or used against them. These are all vulnerabilities that the individual who is being trafficked or being targeted as to be trafficked might struggle with. We do have a lot of people on the call today who have worked with youth, either in the school board, through social work perspectives, or just in their own personal experiences. Another massive vulnerability that a lot of people that have been targeted for trafficking might display or have is that of adverse childhood experiences. Things like a rough home life growing up, things like split families, things like abuse at a young age, or witness to violence. All of these adverse childhood experiences that we often think about and see and are all very aware of on a professional level create vulnerabilities down the road that then someone might be targeted in the human trafficking sense. At this point, I do want to change gears a little bit and move away from understanding human trafficking to how it actually appears today statistically. I think there's a huge value in understanding some of the numbers that we see along the way when it comes to human trafficking. So all of the numbers that you're going to see during today's presentation are coming from the National Human Trafficking Symposium from this past spring. With that being said, everything is being backed by Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking along the way. If anybody has any questions about the numbers that they see during this presentation, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to get you all the studies, all the resources along the way, and make those connections. One thing that I think is really important for us to identify with human trafficking today is that 85% of victims are identifying that their partner is their trafficker. That means that the majority of folks that are coming forward, whether they actually identify as being trafficked initially or not, are seeing a romantic relationship to the person that is doing the trafficking in this moment. At this time, there's a number of challenges when it comes to these pieces, when it goes into how someone interacts with their partner along the way. Biggest thing that we're seeing is that idea of a Romeo or a boyfriend as a perpetrator that we do talk about a little bit during 101 as the type of human trafficking perpetrator is coming to the absolute forefront and is becoming the majority of cases that we see. At this point, we're also seeing that 7 out of 10 victims are being born in Canada and trafficked domestically. That means that we are seeing, there is a percentage for sure that are not, but with that being said, this is a problem in our backyards. These are folks that are born and raised in our community and are being taken advantage of and exploited in the same area. Again, they might be transported to a different area, different region within the province or within the country, but they are Canadians. They are born here. They are growing up in our communities, in our school systems. It is not for a lack of understanding of a foreign country that some people might stereotype. The biggest thing that we're understanding is that this does happen here, and it's happening to people who are born here. The next thing that we're seeing is that there are unusually high averages in certain places in the province. Of all of the human trafficking cases that have been reported in Canada, which again, this does not account for any that have gone unreported, which is a massive number as well. The highest percentage that we're seeing on a provincial basis is right here in Ontario. 65% of national human trafficking cases are happening right here in our province. Again, I understand there's huge urban centers that we do have, like Toronto, Ottawa, all the way down through London, Windsor area. That being said, there are massive percentages of these stats that are coming out of rural communities, coming out of Northern Ontario, coming out of isolated communities. Of this 65%, there is a massive percentage of human trafficking cases that are happening outside of that GTA area. By comparison, the next closest province, the second highest nationwide, is coming from Nova Scotia at 7%. That is telling me that our province in specific needs to look at every potential resource, every potential opportunity to address human trafficking, because we are seeing the bulk of it on a national scale right here in Ontario. That being said, there are some statistics that we're starting to tell a different tale along the way. Looking at things like the fact that the majority of youth that are charged in human trafficking cases are actually female. That provides an interesting perspective, in the sense that we have an idea of what a trafficker should look like in our head. We also have an idea, when we talked about that recruitment phase and how that actually plays into human trafficking. What we're seeing, though, is that the majority of the youth that are being charged with human trafficking at this point, when they are female, it does start to tell a story about maybe there's more to this. Maybe our idea of a perpetrator should look different. Maybe we need to account for the recruitment piece in all of this. But when there are a number of other individuals who are not charged with human trafficking that are not female, there are more components that play into this as well. Of those that were charged, of those females that were reportedly charged with human trafficking, 86% of them were not working alone. This was not a solo operation. There was another individual who was charged with another crime. It might not be human trafficking, but it might have been someone else who was charged with assault, or someone who was charged with conspiracy. Things like different pieces trying to help out or be connected to that criminal investigation that are involved as well. That means that of these females that are being charged, I am not saying that anybody's innocent along the way either when it comes to these cases. But what I am saying is that there is often more to the story, and it's more that we need to look at. The last thing, which I don't like to put the statistic out here in a negative sense, I think it's something that we need to be very aware of, is that the conviction rate for human trafficking charges on a national scale, so nationwide, is about 12%. With that being said, that we will have some individuals that will speak to some of the challenges that come with prosecuting human trafficking cases later on. But the reality is that there are a number of other issues that come up in human trafficking cases that make things quite difficult, quite challenging to prosecute, and quite very, very different as opposed to any other type of criminal investigation. When we look at that 12% conviction rate, we can compare it to some of the other charges that we see regularly, things like domestic violence, things like assault, things like robbery or theft. And when we see those disproportionate percentages, it really does start to paint a picture that human trafficking is a problem with some very, very intricate challenges along the way. At this point, there is something that I do want to focus on, which often gets ignored when we have a conversation about human trafficking. And it's the fact that when we talk about 65% of those cases happening in Ontario, a huge percentage of them flow right through our area, through that GTA corridor, that 401 corridor that we often hear people mention or talk about and often don't really think about. But this is basically a direct line that connects the south end of the province, anywhere from Windsor, Sarnia, London, all the way through to the north to Ottawa. And then it is an avenue all the way through. There is one highway that runs explicitly right through all of these places, the 401. But with that being said, all of the surrounding areas and surrounding communities are vastly impacted along the way. The reason why I bring this up is because we often see a huge percentage of human trafficking cases that are happening in these communities along the way and are connected. Someone who is charged in Toronto all of a sudden appears in Ottawa, all of a sudden appears in Sarnia, all of a sudden shows up in London, all with similar cases, similar backgrounds, and similar MOs, as they might say. So when we look at these situations, we are seeing it happen along this 401 corridor, as it allows for people to transition between these communities of high risk and high crime rates. With that being said, this is where it starts to become important for us to understand as a rural service provider, as someone who might not grow up in this community. I know we have folks that are on this call from absolutely everywhere today, but there is something to be said for where I work right here in Huron County. We often think about it, our little piece of heaven that is very quiet right on the lake. It's a retirement community. There's a lot of folks that come here to settle down forever. With that being said, this area is a massive feeder into that 401 corridor. As you saw earlier, that corridor stretches the length of the province, but what we don't often understand or consider is that when we go shopping, when we go to Costco, you're going to London, you're going to Kitchener, you're going to Toronto. When we go for entertainment, when we go for shopping, where we go to all of these places, we are not that far removed from this corridor and some of the charges that happen along this way. When we go for higher education, when someone goes away to school, they often will head to, very quickly, London, Sarnia, Kitchener, all the way up to Ottawa. But with that being said, the access to that 401 corridor from our area is significant. The amount of individuals that end up leaving our rural communities and end up somewhere along that corridor or involved in human trafficking cases is drastically increasing year over year. The reason why I make note of this is because we need to be very aware as service providers when we start to have individuals that raise red flags that say, I'm in Hamilton this weekend and I'm in Ottawa next weekend and I'm in Thunder Bay the weekend after that. And that's a casual trip for them. These are some of the red flags that we need to be aware of when it comes to human trafficking cases when we're talking access to that 401 corridor and those being perpetrated regarding some of these cases. So with the 401 corridor in mind, there are things that we can all look for as service providers, building on that HT 101 on a more advanced level. There are some things that we can see in our clients, in those that we serve, whether we're out on the street, walking downtown. There are some things that we'll start to notice with the populations that we're serving. All of these things become vastly important when we're looking at understanding human trafficking and trying to catch it before it actually gets to a point of beyond repair. One of the starting points that I would think is really, really important is understanding that new partners, new friends, individuals that are consuming their time who might not have the best reputation, things that people are showing up all the time. What I'm saying with all of these signs, symptoms, and red flags, this is not a surefire way to determine if someone is involved in human trafficking. These are all things that in combination we can look for as things that might be happening to the people that we're serving in our roles. So things like those new people consuming their time, spending a lot of time with them, new friends, new relationships, and in comparison, seeing that inconsistent break off of communication or distancing from someone else. So not having conversations with that teacher that they used to talk to, or not working with that service provider. You know, if they showed up for counseling 10 out of the last 10 times, and all of a sudden they miss 3 appointments in a row because they've got new friends in the area and they've got something else going on, and they are very, very distant in that communication, it might be something to consider. With that inconsistent, broken, or poor communication with family or friends, if someone is dropping off the map for a couple of days, they're not answering your texts, they're not responding to calls for a few days at a time, we all start to worry about somebody going missing, and we have that idea of somebody being snatched up in a van. But the reality is that human trafficking can look very different, and there's often control mechanisms in place when it comes to communication. We might not hear from someone for a few days at a time. We might not hear from some of the different check-ins that we normally would. Another one that we often see that's a common sign or symptom of human trafficking is distrust or communication drop-off with service providers and supports. Someone who is originally inclined to have conversations with somebody regarding some of these situations, talk about how their partner might not be treating them very well, all these different components. If that drops off all of a sudden, that's another sign that we need to be very aware of. On a preliminary level, we can see it very quickly. We see it happen more often than not, and we see it happen on a very quick turnaround, is that incomes and possessions are not necessarily matching occupations. This is something that is really important when we start to see a student who shows up to high school with a brand new iPhone and a $1,200 Gucci bag. I don't know many people that pump gas and can afford those types of things. I certainly cannot. When we start to see some of these possessions change, right? Things like new cars, things like massive amounts of cash transactions. These are all things that we can look at and start to see as red flags when someone has these possessions, but is not matching their income or their funding sources. Again, when we start to see a community that is involved with Ontario Works or ODSP, if all of a sudden their possessions are not matching some of those levels, that should be a red flag for us as service providers to start to look into, okay, what has happened that's gotten us to this point? Again, maybe they found income, which would be absolutely incredible, but these are things that we need to consider along the way. The last one again, building on that 401 corridor, is understanding that frequent travel through high-risk areas associated with human trafficking, through the GTA, through London, through Sarnia, through Ottawa, and frequently bouncing around. If someone is, like we said, dropping off the map and popping back up across the province 3 days later, these are all things that are red flags, especially for us as stakeholders, and things that we need to consider along the way when we're trying to understand what human trafficking might look like. So building on our training from HT 101 and some of the signs and symptoms that we're seeing along the way, when we do see these signs, it's often difficult for us to have these conversations or get to a point where someone is available to have that conversation, and even more difficult to get them to a point where an open disclosure does happen. What I do want to talk about is if we get to a point where disclosure happens in a perfect world. There's going to be a number of different pieces along the line from start to finish where we will see red flags and we will see massive barriers for the individual that is engaging along the way. Generally, in that perfect world, we have somebody that shows up and gives a statement to hopefully police, whether it be us, they might disclose to somebody initially, whether it's friend, family member, or anybody under the sun, and then they hopefully take that directly to the police. What we're operating on is the assumption that all of these things are happening in a perfect scenario. Oftentimes, we're not going to have this. Oftentimes, there will not be a statement to police. Oftentimes, the disclosure will come out muddled or inconsistent, or they might redact it, or some of those pieces along the way. But in that ideal world, we start with a disclosure, then a statement to police, and then hopefully there's some sort of charges that are laid that comes out of it. This can be very difficult as well, not because police aren't doing the jobs, but because there's a lot of challenges that come with laying charges during human trafficking investigations. It can be quite difficult. There's a lot of different components that go into this. But again, we are hoping that charges are laid at this point. This is one of the initial points where we're starting to see some barriers, when all of a sudden the police are involved, when they are actively laying charges or putting someone in handcuffs, when they are actively saying that someone is no longer allowed to communicate with someone else. There are barriers to the human trafficking process for the individual who knows nothing further than that. From there, the initial court proceedings and the sentencing process can be very, very difficult. It's often very difficult to have someone attend court, even on a good day. I don't want to go for a traffic ticket, let alone seeing someone show up who's been through a human trafficking situation. I can't imagine begin what they're going through at that point, but it is quite difficult for them to work through an entire court process. From that sentencing process, again, that piece where there might actually be a little bit of closure, or what we feel to be closure, can be quite difficult along the way. And as well as the resolution or reintegration. Again, we often believe that once court's over, that's it. More times than not, there are people that will be reintegrated into society, they will be released early, they might have served the duration of sentences if there's jail time involved. And at that point, there is, again, another challenge. There's more red flags, there's more barriers for our person who's survived a human trafficking situation. And the fact that they are dealing with a lot of different pieces along the way, especially around the resolution or reintegration following whatever comes out of court. This is a document that we talked about in depth during Human Trafficking 101 in the past fall. It's we call it our Pathways to Safety document. It is something we will send out to absolutely everyone along the way. I do just want to touch on it quickly because I think it's very, very important, and it's something that holds a lot of value when it comes to individuals who are in stakeholder roles trying to support human trafficking victims. So what we've done is we've broken it out into a time period model. So you should be able to, from this time of disclosure, be able to work through this document, work through this chart, and start to assess some needs. So things like, what are we doing when we initially make contact within 1 to 2 hours of contact, as opposed to 12 to 24? How does that look different? And what are some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves as stakeholders? Not necessarily asking the client themselves, but what are we assessing along the way? If you are outside of our region, if you're not from Huron, Perth, Bruce Grey area, you can very much use this document as well. All you'll have to do is substitute in the services that are down the far right side. Again, we break this document out all the way through 1 to 2 weeks of contact and onward. All you need to do is implement your local services as the tool, as the resolution piece. So something like CMHA is across the province. By just making sure that you're contacting your local unit is probably the best starting point. Things like the women's shelter is going to look very different. There's different shelters in different regions, but understanding that if you should be calling a shelter, the local shelter in your region is probably the same appropriate resource at that time. Again, we will make sure that we send out the Pathways to Safety documents for everybody to use, or to be able to use that template. And we do think it's a very, very useful tool, especially if you don't often come across human trafficking cases. It's a phenomenal starting point to work through some of these challenges, some of these questions. So with that being said, when we talked about that ideal timeline, we often understand that there's going to be some places where there is a time of increased need. As stakeholders, we do have an obligation to try and work with some of the folks that we are coming through this, especially, and provide some of those extra supports around some of these key points. So that first point of contention is that disclosure or intervention by law enforcement. The day that they come to a police station, the day they let someone know who's a professional in some capacity that they're experiencing human trafficking, is a time of increased need. They need a ton of support initially right out of the gate to make sure that every single need is met in that moment. Again, we will talk about some of these challenges coming up, but it is a massively important time that we need to be aware of. The next one is prior to sentencing, especially the court process in general can be very, very difficult. Oftentimes not. The court process might not look like what we think it's going to look like, or might play out differently. But prior to the conclusion of court, so prior to sentencing, prior to these pieces, there is a lot of pressure on that individual who's come forward and experienced and survived human trafficking to play a role. There is a lot of looking to them for an outcome. There's a lot of looking to them to see if they feel better or feel worse about a situation. And some of those internal feelings can create a lot of turmoil for that individual. This is an important time for us to be aware that when we interact with these people, there might be increased needs. There might be, an extended hours need. There might be that call at 2 a.m. that requires a bit of support. As stakeholders, it's very important to be aware of when your client's needs might increase during these time periods. The last one that I always like to talk about is that prior to reintegration, we want to believe that bad guys go away and get locked up forever. Unfortunately, they do come back out. Unfortunately, that person still has to live with the fact that they survived it and are often not working alone. There's other individuals that are often involved when it comes to human trafficking cases. When it comes to reintegration of that offender, there's going to be a need to make sure that that person feels safe. There's going to be an increased need for that person to have the communication, have the support and resources available in those moments. Again, our goal is to make sure that that person is supported from start to finish, regardless of what service we provide, whether we're in the schools, whether we're in the hospitals, whether we are anywhere under the sun. We all want what's best for the people that we support. And we need to be very aware that during times of increased need, that we might have additional requirements that that person might need in order to be successful. At this point, I've been talking for about 40 minutes. I do want to take just a quick break, just a couple of minutes. When we come back, we'll have a conversation. We are going to take about a 3-minute break. We'll just get up, stretch your legs. When we come back, I will try and give as much information as possible about some really key points that we can actually implement today in order to be more successful in our training and be more supportive along the way. So I'll see everybody back here at about 9:45. Thanks. All right, everybody, welcome back. Thank you for taking the time. Again, we appreciate it. We do want to make sure that we thank the folks that have made this available for today. The Central Huron Donation Fund was the one who provided the funding for us to be able to put on this webinar series for the community. Again, we hope it's been helpful so far. There's been a lot of information. What I'm hoping to do next is I'm hoping to lay out a path to successful intervention. for stakeholders. How do we actually engage? How do we set ourselves up for success? I understand that a lot of the information that we've gone over might not be new information for folks so far, but it's important to have. What I do hope is that we can have a very real conversation about what we need to do in order to support these people when it comes to human trafficking going forward. With that being said, if there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A as I go along here. We will have a period to take some questions again prior to the panel, and then again we will open it up for questions to our panel as well. So when we are looking at having a path to successful intervention as stakeholders for individuals who've experienced human trafficking, first thing that we need to be very aware of is that our opportunities for intervention are incredibly limited. When it comes to human trafficking cases, we might only get 1 or 2 opportunities to have a conversation with a client, much less actually be able to provide them service in a safe environment. We need to be very aware that when these opportunities pop up, that we know our resources, that we know our contacts, and we know that what our process is going to look like. If your agency doesn't have a process and is looking for some support and is going, I'm not really sure where to start, please reach out to us at Victim Services. We're happy to help. It's our job to triage. It's our job to be aware of some of these pieces. But please understand that when you have someone who comes forward and says, I believe that I'm a victim of human trafficking, or they might not even identify it as such, and we might see some of the red flags or signs or symptoms that we talked about earlier, our opportunity to intervene is incredibly limited. We only have so many opportunities to do so, and we need to know what our resources are, know who we're calling before we even have the opportunity for any of that to happen. This is one of the biggest points that I want to hit on from this entire presentation, and it's something that I find incredibly important. Client buy-in, the individual who is being victimized, the person who has survived human trafficking up to this point, their involvement and choices must be a priority. There are going to be instances where we aren't able to respect certain pieces of that, and I get that piece as well. I understand that everyone has confidentiality, everyone has their own agency policies, and everyone has their own duty to report. I respect those pieces. What I will say during this entire training is that their buy-in and their involvement along the way, wherever possible, must be a priority. We have to walk the path with them. We have to figure out where they're at, respect some of their choices, because oftentimes they will know better than we will as stakeholders. Not always, but there's a lot of opportunity where we do need to be aware of their buy-in, their choices, and encouraging their involvement along the way. Have them sit with you to make some of those decisions. Have them sit with you to make some of those phone calls, but engage that person in a way that they feel that they have the ability to vocalize where they're coming from, some of the struggles they're facing, how they're feeling about a situation, and some of the concerns along the way. The next thing that becomes very important is that it is often very difficult to have conversations with folks who have survived human trafficking situations. It is not an easy conversation to have. But the way that we have these conversations with the individuals that have come forward or those that have experienced it is very, very important. More times than not, they will not identify as a victim. More times than not, they will not identify as being at risk or being in any danger. There is a foolproof way, and again, you can change the words yourself, but as long as you follow this formula, it might not be an easy conversation to have, but it gets increasingly easier to set yourself up to be successful. You have to give yourself every opportunity to be successful and understand that whatever comes out of that might come out of that. The big one that I often see is that we'll often have a question. We'll often have a concern. The way that we raise that becomes very important. So something like recognizing danger. If I believe that someone's at risk and I'm supporting them and I'm having a conversation with them, asking, hey, do you feel safe? Do you believe that there's a problem here? Where are your thoughts? How do you feel about this? And then coming to them with some reason or logic. Again, this is super simple. It sounds super basic, but you'd be amazed when you can structure these conversations and say, this is my question. This is my concern. And here's why I'm feeling this way. I feel a little uneasy because there's been somebody that's been waiting for you to leave the police station when you're talking to me. I feel a little uneasy because I haven't heard from you in 3 days. Here's my reason or logic for why I'm concerned for your safety or why I feel the way that I do. And then at that point, it gives us an opportunity to propose a solution. Say, give your perspective, offer some insight. Something as simple as, I'm not sure what we should do from here, but I want you to know that I'm concerned. Making somebody aware of some of these concerns that we see along the way can be a really, really important and really, really key way for us to start to build some of those relationships that allow for us to actually exit someone from a human trafficking lifestyle. Again, the conversation is not easy. The topic never will be. But if we're able to kind of follow along and have this conversation in that method, so that question, what's my concern? What is the point that I need to bring up? Why do I feel that way? What am I backing? Where am I coming from? I've seen a similar case like this, and this was the outcome. Here's why I'm concerned. I don't want that to be you. And this is what I would propose to try and address that. Can I call someone for you? Can I loop in another service provider? Can I, hey, you should meet my friend at the police station. Hey, you should meet my friend at victim services. Hey, you're struggling with substance use. I know some great people at Choices for Change. Let's make sure that we connect them and do that soft handoff. And when we do that proposed solution, it's, again, we're not forcing an outcome, but we're strongly steering it in a direction that we have a little bit of control and to try and support that person right from the outset. The fourth point that I want us all to take away from today is that the needs of the client that we are working with, whether they're perceived or real in that moment, must be a priority. When we have someone that surfaces, when they disclose that they've survived a human trafficking situation, whether they were involved in that lifestyle, we need to meet every single need that that person has, or they will not exit the lifestyle. They will not remove themselves from those situations if any of their needs are not met. That might be substance use, it might be a roof over their head, it might be safety, it might be emotional needs. If we cannot be certain that the needs, whether they are actual needs or not, of that person are met, the likelihood of them heading back to that lifestyle, returning, or connecting with people who they were previously connected to, falling back into dangerous habits or dangerous lifestyle choices, are things that are almost certainly guaranteed to happen if we are not able to meet their needs. Again, I know there's a lot of agencies on this call today that'll go, well, it's our job to handle addictions, or it's our job to handle homelessness, or I only work in education. The best thing about it, though, is that there's over 100 people on this call as we currently speak right now, and we all do something. We all have the ability to play a role and be experts in one little area. If we are able to loop in those services in order to make sure that every single need is met, we provide an opportunity for that person to exit the lifestyle. That is what we have to do in order to make sure that the needs, again, they might be totally fictional. They might not be something that person totally understands. They might be saying, I need $1 million. Well, I can't get you $1 million, but I can make sure that there's financial backing from somewhere. These are things that we need to be very aware of when we're trying to work through the needs of our clients and making them a priority. The next thing is that collaboration is key. I know that when I speak to every single person that's on this call right now, every single organization will say, I love collaboration. I think it's great. I want every single organization to work together. And then I also get a lot of people that say, but I need you to sign a consent form. But I can't do that because it doesn't fall within the scope of our agency. And there's a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges. The reality of this is that when it comes to human trafficking, statistics mean nothing. On an organizational level, whether we have 100 human trafficking cases or our partners or our neighbors down the street have 5. Our statistics, I know that funding is based on statistics, but more importantly, we need to make sure that we're working collaboratively to support these people. Working in silos can be very, very dangerous. It's very, very easy for us to say, well, I do one thing. Collaboration is the absolute paramount point when it comes to stakeholder support of someone who's experienced human trafficking. We need to work collectively. And again, I am not saying that we all have to do everything. Specialization is a good thing. We need to be very aware that we are all good at something individually. Some of us are housing experts. Some of us are education experts. Some of us are healthcare experts. But the reality is that we all need to be at the table in order to effectively support someone who's coming out of a human trafficking situation. Again, it sounds negative, and I really don't mean for it to. But what I do hope in a very positive way is that we can create a culture of shared responsibility when it comes to human trafficking clients. Anybody who's been involved in a human trafficking situation or survived that lifestyle, if we can create a culture where we are all responsible for that person's success, where we are all invested in wanting that person to be the best they possibly can be going forward and have the best possible outcomes, we're already further ahead. We need to focus on collaboration. Collaboration is absolutely crucial when it comes to human trafficking cases. The next thing that's really important to understand is that risk can be mitigated and that threats must be taken seriously. We will talk about risk and threat assessment down the road through other seminars. With that being said, it's very important to understand that a good safety plan can do wonders. When we're looking at how we address some of the concerns that we're seeing with the folks that we're servicing, we can put things in place to deal with. We can look at, that idea of how do we make sure that we don't crash our car while we drive the speed limit and we stop at stop signs, right? We can be aware of some of the risk in those pieces. With that being said, threats to that person's safety must be taken very seriously. if there's something that we can't mitigate, if there's something that we don't have the ability, or that some of the stakeholders that we might reach out to don't have the ability to address, we must take that very seriously when it comes to the safety of the individuals that we're working with. There are certain threats that we cannot account for, and I appreciate that. With that being said, a good safety plan is very important. And then if we are working beyond the scope of that safety plan, there might require some more intensive intervention from someone outside of our own agency. Very important to understand that risk can be mitigated in most cases, but we really do need to take threats seriously, especially when they go beyond the scope of what we're able to do. The last and most important point that I want us to be aware of when it comes to human trafficking is that biases and assumptions must be managed. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. What works in one human trafficking case might not work down the road. It might not be helpful for the next individual. The same language or verbiage, the same approach, the same skills, the same needs are not going to look very, very similar depending on the case. It's very important that we manage our assumptions about what is best. We must take that open approach to anybody that comes forward with disclosure. When it comes to bias, when it comes to assumptions, especially as stakeholders who handle a lot of cases all the time that we might not see as human trafficking, we need to take that open approach to ensure that we're giving every opportunity for everyone to be successful going down the road. With that, there's often some types of bias that we see that as stakeholders that can be very, very important for us to manage. The first one is that confirmation bias. Many of you will have heard of all of these before, but they do all apply to human trafficking cases in the fact that we will often look for evidence to fit the assumptions that we have. If we see someone who comes in who is potentially using substances, we very quickly look for things that might relate to their substance use. We might look for some of the poor choices that are being related to that substance use and not some of the other challenges they might be facing. It is very easy for us to paint a picture and fill in the details afterwards. Confirmation bias is something we need to be very aware of. Diagnosis and frequency bias is another one that I find very, very important and something that we need to focus on. We all, as service providers, have somebody that we see their number ring on our phone and we're going, okay, what do we need to do for this person this time? We have frequent flyers, there's mental health diagnoses, there's different pieces that we all understand, but we need to be very, very aware of when we're providing service to absolutely everyone. It's something that we have to be on top of, is that frequency bias and diagnosis bias. So making assumptions based on how often we talk to someone or what the diagnoses that they're struggling with might be can inhibit our ability to clearly judge whether this person's at risk and cannot help us when we're looking at trying to set this person up for success. The next one is availability bias. So when we work in a certain area, we see the same thing over and over. If you work in education, you probably see a lot of the same similar problems that someone else who works in education. Likewise with healthcare, law enforcement, or anything else under the sun. We very often see something that's available to us on a regular basis. And we often go, okay, what path do I normally take to address that situation? Is this just another case? For a lot of agencies, it might be something like homelessness or domestic violence. And we go, okay, well, I've seen 100 domestics this year, and this is what I do every single time it's a domestic. When it comes to availability bias, we really do need to check that bias in the sense that not all cases are the same. Every case is going to be individually different. And when we start to apply that, what are we used to seeing model and what do we normally do model, it starts to inhibit our ability to, again, realistically assess for safety and realistically assess for some of those signs, symptoms, and red flags that we talked about earlier. The last one that I think is really important, and it's very, it's a little bit less common than some of the other types of bias, but it's one that is also very important, is intimacy bias. The way that we have relationships in our own lives can be very, very different from the people that we serve. The same relationships that we trust, the same people that we would go to, the same way that we would approach a situation, the folks that we rely on in our own lives might not be the same for a lot of other individuals along the way. The relationship with parents, the relationship with siblings, partner, friends in the area, all of these different relationships that we have, even the way that we communicate with our coworkers or our dog at home. Again, it might be very, very different from the people that we're providing service to. If we are not aware of intimacy bias, we tend to go, okay, well, what does your support network look like? And is it similar to mine? We need to be very aware of that when we're talking about some of these pieces when supporting human trafficking victims, because it does create a different path than one that we're often used to. I don't want to take another break quite yet, but I do want to get to a point where I want to open up the floor. Is there any questions about anything that we've covered so far, anything that we've talked about in the first session? What I'm really hoping, we will send takeaways on absolutely everything we talk about today, just to summarize some of these points, especially those last 7 about how we can really be successful when we're interacting and trying to help someone who's experienced human trafficking. But I do want us to make sure that if there is any questions or anything that's come out of the last little while, that we're able to do so. It would be now would be a great time if anybody does have any questions, anything thus far. Oh, Tammy, I see that you have your hand raised there. I appreciate you raising your hand. Unfortunately, we don't have audio capability. If you're just able to type your question into the question and answer box, it just makes it a little bit easier. Again, I apologize for audio. It creates a whole other world of technical difficulties when we have folks mic'd, unmic'd going throughout the seminar. So if you're able just to type it in, I would love to answer your question. Are there any slang words? So we have a question from Tracy. Are there any slang words for human trafficking that our clients may know that we may not be aware of? Absolutely. So as part of the HT 101 that we went over, we did send out a terminology sheet. We will absolutely send that out again when it comes to the handouts after the fact. So you do have just a list of terminology that might be used as part of the game, as they might call it. There's a lot of different pieces when it comes to the terminology is constantly changing. Again, we will have a panel portion a little bit later on where I'll have, there will be some folks on from law enforcement perspective who might be able to speak to some of the terms that they're hearing currently. The one thing that I can say when it comes to terminology, there's things that we're always going to hear when it comes to terminology like pimps, johns, bottom bitch, some of those other pieces that don't change. But with that being said, the individuals that are perpetrating human trafficking are very, very quick to do so and very quick to change the way that they communicate as the game progresses, right? As we know that terminology, they're looking for a new way to say the same thing so that they can get their point across without us as service providers being aware. The one thing that I can say is that more intuitively, it's not necessarily about the terminology that we might be hearing, but more so that gut feeling. If something seems wrong, it likely is. More times than not. So being aware of it, whether it's a human trafficking case or something else, if we're aware of, that gut instinct that something doesn't seem right, my client is far too comfortable in some situation that seems potentially risky or dangerous, regardless of the terminology that they're using. Again, we will absolutely send out the list that we currently have, but we also need to be very aware that the terminology changes quite quickly. And the second we put together a new list, there's those bad people out there that are perpetrating are looking for new ways to say the same thing. Hopefully that answers your question. Awesome. Is there any other questions at this point? Just, I do want to make sure that we give every opportunity. We will have a panel portion coming up in the next little while that I'm hoping will add a whole lot of value, but I do want to make sure that anything that we covered today, any of the finer details, if there is any questions, what I do hope that we're able to take away from today's session, if not for anything else, is if you are confused, if you are lost, if you're not sure what to do, please reach out to us. We're happy to assist. We will never, ever not answer the phone because we're busy. We're looking for every opportunity. We will call you back. We will get you the information you're looking for. Please reach out to us if you have inquiries about human trafficking pieces thus far. Consultation on policy, we're happy to do it. A little bit of guidance on what might be next, or even if you're looking to connect somebody to resources, please reach out to your local victim services. It's anything that we can do to support when it comes to human trafficking cases becomes very, very important. I will just give it one more minute if there is any questions at this point. Again, I also can appreciate that there is a level of not wanting to ask questions in a group setting. If anybody has anything after the fact, you can always shoot us an email. You can always reach out to us after the fact. If you do have questions that you don't want answered publicly, we will absolutely do so. We'll get you the information. We'll get you the statistics along the way. Oh, this is awesome. So we have a question or a note from Colleen as well. So Colleen works for one of our victim services units in Algoma. Says that terminology also has to do with location as well. So they have, again, they have a massive number of HD cases up there as well. And they've only ever had one person, when I refer to it as the game, right? Down in the south end of Huron County, we often hear the term the game, people involved in the game, you know, all of those pieces. They don't often refer to it in the north the same way. So that is a huge example right there of how that terminology looks different, right? Again, same province, same people. We're often seeing those people that are surfacing in the north are often the same people surfacing in the south. And you know, we're offering support everywhere along the way, but when it comes to terminology, it looks very different even on a regional level. So that's a really awesome point. Thank you for making that, Curleen. I appreciate that. I'll just give it one more minute. If there's anybody else that has questions, that's great. If not, I will. We can take another quick break just for a moment. When we come back, we are going to look at having a panel option. I'll do an introduction of our panelists at that point, and then we can go from there. If we have some questions that we've already received for them, and then we'll absolutely open it up for other questions as well. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now. Why don't we all just take a quick 5 minutes? We'll come back at, say, not quite 5 minutes, but why don't we come back at 10:10 and we'll get the panel portion started. Thanks. Awesome. So we're all gonna, I'm gonna just have everybody hop back on here. So we are just getting ready for the panel portion here of our human trafficking advanced level training. I will take an opportunity. We do have a great panel portion coming up with some people who have a wealth of experience talking about human trafficking, coming from different backgrounds. I do want to take an opportunity at this point to introduce everybody. Then we do have some questions that we've already received for them that we'll go through very quickly. I'm going to have them, I know that they're popping on right now. They're just adding their cameras. That's awesome. So I will just go through a list of panelists that we do have available today. If you do have questions for them, please feel free to throw them in the question and answer. We will try and get to them. If we're not able to answer them in this moment, we will make sure that we get you the information after the fact. So just working through our panel, we do have Detective Sergeant, David Greer. He's been policing for 12 years at this point. He's been involved in the Huron County Crime Unit for the last 4. With the Huron County Crime Unit, he's also part of our Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition. So he brings a wealth of knowledge and background when it comes to human trafficking, especially on areas of policing within the Ontario Provincial Police. He's been a part of several human trafficking investigations regarding sex trafficking and labor trafficking, both within the region, and we're thrilled to have him here as well. So Dave, if you just want to give a quick wave. Awesome, thank you so much again for being here. We also have the acting Crown Attorney for Perth County, Elizabeth Wilson. She's been practicing law since 2005 and says that she's still learning, but we're thrilled to have her here because of the amount of wealth of knowledge that she brings as well. She joined Perth County's Crown Attorney's Office in 2015 and became the acting Crown in January 2021. Prior to serving with the Crown Attorney's Office, she worked as the in-house legal counsel for Children's Aid Society and the Victim Witness Services worker. Liz has a particular interest in prosecuting cases involving physical and sexual abuse and empowering women and children in the court process. She's found that human trafficking cases are among the most challenging and rewarding prosecutions to date. Again, we're so thrilled to have her here. Elizabeth, if you don't mind just giving a wave so everybody knows who you are. Awesome. We also have Deborah Logue on the call. So she's the executive director with Victim Services, has experience dealing with vulnerable populations from Huron County all the way to Ottawa. She's spent over 25 years working in the field, working with these vulnerable populations, and spends a lot of time working with these individuals on various different levels. Individually, she's worked in 25 different cases, either on a frontline or consultative method in the last 2 years, related directly to human trafficking and the victims along the way. The last individual that we have on our panel for today is Staff Sergeant Jeff McGregor from the Stratford Police Service. Jeff's began his career in policing with Waterloo Region in 2008, joining the Stratford Police Service in 2012. Jeff's background includes policing and spending time as a detective constable and detective sergeant. Jeff has been involved in human trafficking investigations since 2015 and has assisted in projects focused on human trafficking in Waterloo and London. Jeff also serves as a guest speaker and instructor at the Ontario Police College in their senior level human trafficking course and is involved in all of the training that officers receive on a provincial level. Again, thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate it. There is a diverse background and we're hoping to offer a very, very different perspective. What I'm hoping is that we do have some questions that we've already received from individuals along the way. So I am going to jump right into those. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see their wonderful faces and not this PowerPoint anymore. So what we're going to do is I would love to give everybody an opportunity. I understand that some people might have similar perspectives or some similar answers for some of these questions, but I do want to give everybody an opportunity to answer all of these questions that we've received so far. So the first one, and we'll just start going around based on my screen where things are at. If we can start by just telling us a little bit about your experience regarding human trafficking and what you find most challenging about it in your role. So Elizabeth, if we could start with you about what you might find. I apologize putting you on the spot first, but what do you find most, tell us about your experience and what's most difficult about your role when it comes to human trafficking?
So I just wanted to thank everybody for their interest today. I appreciate that we're all dealing with a backlog of cases, so I do appreciate you taking the time to be here. I have experience prosecuting human trafficking cases in London, and occasionally issues relating to human trafficking do pop up in Stratford. So what I've done is I've drawn on my experience in sexual violence cases, child protection cases. My role as a prosecutor is to prosecute criminal code offenses laid by police, and I do that on behalf of the Crown. but really it's the public. My role as a prosecutor is different than my role as a human being. I'm sure you all encounter that in your work, and that can be, for me, the most challenging part of my job, is focusing on my role as a prosecutor, but also being a human being at the same time. So in terms of the Crown's assessment of a case, it always boils down to two things. One, is there public interest in the prosecution? And two, is there a reasonable prospect of a conviction in any given case? The two both have to be present in order for the Crown to proceed with the prosecution. When we're talking about human trafficking cases, public interest really isn't an issue, in that I've never come across a case of human trafficking where there wasn't a public interest in prosecuting. Usually the struggle is with a reasonable prospect of a conviction, which is a different standard than whether police have reasonable and probable grounds. It can be challenging in any criminal prosecution, but Dawson, as you were saying earlier, it can be particularly challenging in human trafficking cases, unlike any other cases. Especially in situations where the complainant, and I use the term complainant because it's the term in the criminal code. I also use the term victim because it's also found in the criminal code. It can be challenging in situations where a complainant or an alleged victim or a victim is not supportive of the prosecution for a variety of legitimate reasons. The accused in a criminal prosecution, so someone who's been charged with human trafficking offenses like any other accused person, is presumed innocent. They are not required to disprove anything. They're not required to say anything. It's the Crown who has the onus to prove an offense beyond a reasonable doubt. Corroboration is not legally required. So there's no legal requirement that a victim's testimony be corroborated by some sort of outside evidence. That being said, in human trafficking cases, corroboration can be key in terms of a successful prosecution, especially when a victim's reluctant, especially when a victim is recanting her earlier statement to police, or a victim legitimately has difficulty remembering. And you know, I'm sure people here today have learned a lot about trauma and the impact it can have on someone's ability to recall events. And in criminal court, we're very focused on chronology and narratives, and that can be really challenging for victims to recall very traumatic events. It can also be as a result of, you know, the use of the use of substances, not consumptions, or consumption at the time of the events. That can also have an impact on memory. So, I mean, these are legitimate issues. There are many reasons why a victim wouldn't want to participate in the process. Fear, you know, lots of other pressures that might be present in their life. So we try to build cases around the victim so that it's not solely focused on the victim's testimony. We have corroborating pieces of evidence: cell phone, computer data, security footage, hotel records, police surveillance, expert evidence, and we try to focus and wrap around a victim's testimony. So I would reframe maybe what we consider a successful prosecution. To many people, a successful prosecution is a conviction. To me, that's not what a successful prosecution is. And I try to refocus. Otherwise, I don't think I could continue to do what I do, because there aren't a lot of convictions, right? It's have we surrounded the victim? Have we provided her with support? And if ultimately there isn't a conviction, is she better off having gone through the process? Does she feel supported? Does she feel important?
That's a great answer. I really appreciate the insight, especially when it comes to a legal perspective, because this is something that we often don't get to see, right? Understanding this piece is very, very important for us. Staff Sergeant McGregor, I might have to put you on the spot and ask you the same question afterwards, try and get you to follow Elizabeth's answer up here. But tell us about your experience. What's the most challenging thing within your role?
I'd like to echo Liz's earlier comments about thanking yourself, Dawson, and Victim Services for this opportunity to speak, and for everybody who's attending today. So thank you very much. I am with the Stratford Police Service. Some of the views that I share will be my own through the experiences that I have garnered throughout my years involved in these investigations. So my experiences started in 2015. I knew little about human trafficking at that time. And I became involved in a project in Waterloo called Project Northern Spotlight, which has been impacted by COVID, but has been run internationally now for a number of years. And it's where police agencies around the globe focus on sex trade work and using vice probes to reach out and try and make positive contact with sex trade workers. So that was my introduction way back then. Shortly thereafter, I became involved in a human trafficking case. And Dawson, you did such a great job talking about the transient nature of these cases, which is a challenge as well, as we all know. But it spanned from Stratford to Kitchener into Huron County. So it is here. And that's an easy way to put it, or to see that. I've been involved in going back to vice probes, a number of vice probes through projects that we have conducted where I've been the project lead, as well as being seconded to different services to assist on projects there, upwards of around 100 vice probes probably. And if vice probe, for those who are unaware or of that term, it's what police do where we make dates with sex trade workers under the guise of being Johns. And that is a way for us to be able to contact a sex trade worker, knowing full well that normally when you're making these dates, you're actually speaking with a trafficker and not the sex trade worker. We're going into hotels when we do these to make positive contacts, and overall they are positive, and offering assistance to the sex trade worker in any way, shape, or form, or in some cases, rescuing sex trade workers. And that the last time we did a project in Stratford, back-to-back dates saw us rescue 15-year-olds from the sex trade world at that time. I've been the multiple officer in charge of been the officer in charge of multiple cases that have seen their way through the courts. I have 2 cases that were convictions, 6 total convicted parties, which we'll take the wins when we can. The challenge that I'm seeing with human trafficking right now is the major one is, from a policing perspective, is it's a change of mindset. In policing, when we all join the ranks, we want to get the bad guys. That's what's in the brochures. And when it comes to human trafficking and sex trade work, it's very different. The amount of times that we're having contact with a sex trade worker and actually getting charges is low. Those things, you can't score your wins by that. So what we're doing is trying to change the mindset of people that having those positive interactions with sex trade workers is what's going to build the foundation to get them out when they're ready. It's still, get them out might not mean a criminal charge. They may never want to give a statement. In fact, that's the majority of the time in my experience. But if we can surround them with positive experiences to allow them to feel safe to leave when they choose to do so, then I think that's the win. And again, it's a lot of time and a lot of commitment from law enforcement without those charges on the back end. So the change of mindset is definitely important. Also, as you spoke about earlier, Dawson, more and more females in terms of being traffickers, or someone asked earlier about terminology. This is just fact. This isn't me being crude, but we hear the terminology, and you may hear bottom or bottom bitch. That refers to the female who's kind of the trafficker's right hand, and their job is to recruit for them, and they actually assist in facilitating the sex trade worker to be trafficked. So we're seeing more and more of that. We did have in Perth County a female who was the bottom, who was charged with human trafficking. And she actually went so far as to try to distance the trafficker from the investigation in that case. Lastly, for major challenges, and it kind of piggybacks off something Liz just said about building cases around technology, we're finding it works both ways. So obviously, you know, in 2008, when I began policing, prostitution was still done on the streets for the most part. And then as Leo's List, Backpages.com at that time became big, prostitution went underground. And then Backpages got shut down in the United States, and Leo's List and all a plethora of other websites have come forward, and bad guys have learned from it. And they now use different tools on these sites to hide ways that a law enforcement can track them easily. We still have some tools, but there's apps on your phone now that can hide the phone numbers. They can hide their IP addresses easily. So technology is a challenge in these cases to build them together too, because it becomes very important to try and corroborate these cases when we take them to the courts. So it does work both ways.
We did just have a quick follow-up question that came in from one of the folks in the audience for Jeff. With your 2 convictions, without going into any legal, anything that would put any legal jeopardy, are you able to speak on the outcomes, and if they serve time, what the average time that you're looking for, what that might be?
Yeah, I will do my best, and Liz could feel free to jump in as well from maybe the Crown's perspective, but time isn't up. There's guidelines in time, obviously, and what can be sought through the courts. There were 6 convictions total in the 2 cases. One person was a YO who got 8 months, which is substantial for a YO conviction. And in that case, the victim was a youth herself, and the traffickers got, the main players, we'll call them, got 9 years, 8 years, and 6 years respectively. So they all did serve some time. The other case was an adult female victim, and the male trafficker got 6 years and the female trafficker got 4 years. When it comes to a youth victim, there are mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years. I do know that there's been some challenge to that through the court processes in whether or not that is constitutionally sound. I'm not sure where those are sitting right now, those challenges, but those cases went through appeal courts as well, and all convictions were upheld. It's substantial time. For me personally, it's never enough. Again, this is a personal thought. You can't do anything worse than traffic somebody. But it is substantial time.
Awesome. Thank you for providing that insight. I know that there's a lot of people that are always curious about some of those hard numbers and how those actual outcomes play out on the backside of what we all see in our own roles as stakeholders. I do want to ask the same question, Detective Greer, if you just want to speak about kind of your experience regarding human trafficking and what you find most challenging about the role.
Thank you very much. Again, I just want to echo what Liz and Jeff has said about the limited opportunities for interventions and how you have to reframe success. If you look at success as we all would love to have enough information to lay a charge and for that charge to go all the way through to a conviction, then unfortunately, you're not going to be successful a lot. If you look at success as making a positive contact with somebody and able to convince them to look at, what lifestyle they're in and get out of that lifestyle, or even just plant that seed so that eventually they're able to look at things differently in the future, then that could be the success that you're looking for. So you just have to reframe that so that all you're doing is you're trying to plant that seed so that in the future, they may be able to take that and move that forward. And if you reframe success looking at it like that, then you're going to be more successful in connecting with people, and you're not going to get as frustrated about the processes.
Awesome. Thank you. And last but not least, sorry to keep you waiting, Deb. If you could speak to your experience with human trafficking, what it might look like, and what you find really challenging about your role as opposed to some of these differing perspectives that we might have from justice or law enforcement.
I just want to speak to some of my earlier experience with human trafficking, which it wasn't deemed that at the time because I started my career a couple of years ago. There was a lot of young women that were started in a youth justice center, a correction facility for young offenders. And a lot of our female offenders were in there for drug-related crimes or B&E crimes and that kind of stuff. But as you listen to their story and you hear some of their circumstances they're in, it would, in hindsight, it was definitely human trafficking. They were being managed by an individual that was making them do certain criminal activities and participate in things that put them in conflict with the law and ended up getting arrested for. But they were reaping the benefits and not the young girls. So, but back then it wasn't necessarily deemed as that. So those young people did have charges, and it wasn't taken into consideration. But I think in my bio you indicated around my role more as the executive director is more in consultation with the frontline staff that are doing the boots on the ground work. But I think we still struggle with shifting the mindset of some of our individuals that have been trafficked to actually recognize that that's what's happening to them, because they do believe that they're in love with their person that's managing them, and not seeing it for what it is, or not recognizing it. It's more maybe viewed as, we had a bad date, or we had a fight, or we had something like that, as opposed to the level of coercion and manipulation and control that's going on in that environment. They don't necessarily see it as such. So I find that's one of the biggest challenges, shifting that mindset so they're open to accepting supports, because a lot of them feel that they're not in jeopardy. The other key factor is if we can't meet their needs, they can't leave. So housing right now is brutal. As we all know, we struggle with housing opportunities, and affordable housing specifically, and safe housing as a secondary part is very difficult. So for someone to leave somewhere that they are being housed, regardless of whether they're having sex for that housing, it's a tough gig if you can't provide them something. And with our shelters being at capacity and normal housing being so limited, it's very difficult to do that. So we need to be mindful of not making promises we can't follow through on, because that's not fair to the person we're supporting.
Absolutely. I think that, again, every stakeholder on here can speak to, and I'm sure we've all seen the unfortunate shortages when it comes to resources, when it comes to housing, when it comes to some of the challenges these folks are facing that are ongoing. The next question that we just received it right now, that it might be of some benefit. Again, I'm just going to work through everybody again, hopefully in a little bit of a different order. But Detective Greer, from your perspective, what are some of the more concerning issues that you're seeing when it comes to human trafficking, or any of the associated legal processes? So what are some of the most concerning issues that you're seeing?
One of the biggest hurdles that I've encountered is because of this Romeo style. They don't believe that they're the victim. They don't believe that they're having issues or at risk. And so convincing them that there is risk going on and that they are putting themselves in danger, or that somebody else is putting them in danger, is the biggest hurdle that I've encountered, because you're at the same time that you're trying to keep the interaction positive and not lose them and not insult them or anything like that, and keep things moving forward, you're also trying to argue a point that sometimes they can't see. So that's why I go back to that analogy of planting a seed, and maybe something you say at the beginning is enough that they can think about it and in the future act on that.
That's a very important perspective. Again, I think that being able to understand that coming from a different lens, it is quite a challenge. So operating on some of those principles that we talked about earlier, again, whether we're law enforcement or we're stakeholders, the things that we are actively trying to implement to be successful. We want to give everybody that same opportunity with that same goal of making that person, giving them every opportunity to be successful moving forward. Elizabeth, what about yourself? What are some of the most concerning issues that you're seeing when it comes to the human trafficking process or any of the associated legal processes?
So I'll go back to a comment Jeff made with respect to technology and build on that. And I'll borrow from the Supreme Court, a unanimous Supreme Court in a seminal decision, Regina versus Friesen, that was released in 2020. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's a unanimous Supreme Court talking about child sex abuse in particular and sentencing in child sex abuse cases, and the Supreme Court got it. One thing that the Supreme Court made reference to in its decision, and it's FRIESEN, is the fact that social media has given predators, I'll call them, unprecedented access to potential victims. And online luring is occurring, leading to child sex trafficking. The proliferation of what is called child pornography, also known as child sexual exploitation material or imagery, is occurring. And there are no geographic boundaries in terms of child luring on the internet. And we've seen that here in our jurisdiction, and we've seen that in other jurisdictions. And so there's a crossover in terms of geographic boundaries. And even if the trafficking doesn't necessarily occur in this jurisdiction, the luring might be happening in this jurisdiction, or vice versa. On the issue of crossover, I see in my experience, which is anecdotal, it's not statistical, a lot of crossover between human trafficking and children who are involved in the child welfare system. And in particular, 16 to 17-year-old girls. And sometimes it appears that there may be some hesitation in terms of people being involved in the court process along with the victim. So coming to court with her, supporting her. I certainly appreciate that in some circumstances, that's not going to make any sense. In some circumstances, the victim doesn't want someone coming to court with her, doesn't want someone, physically in court. And in fact, that might impact on her ability to speak freely in court about her victimization. But I would really encourage, to the extent that you can, appropriately within your role and staying in your lane in terms of what's appropriate and what's not, to be involved in the court process, especially if you're the statutory parent, right? So children who are in care, their statutory parent is the society. And, feel free to reach out to me for information if it involves one of our prosecutions. I mean, there's limitations on what you can disclose. But I have a duty to report children who are in need of protection, and I can give you court dates. Courts. I mean, there's just more information that could be shared, and not just in urgent situations, but kind of planning for the future. This matter is eventually going to go to trial. What can I do to assist, the victim in the process, or even telling me, I don't think it would assist if I'm involved in the process, and this is why. So I would encourage people to get involved in the court process. Again, kind of wrapping around a victim for support. Consent, the issue of consent. I am so glad people are talking about consent, capacity to consent, what is consent, when is consent withdrawn. But when we're talking about human trafficking, you cannot consent to human trafficking. And so, I want to avoid reading from the code because that can be kind of dry, but it's really clear in the criminal code. No consent is valid. So, sometimes I hear people focusing on the issue of well, this is a consensual situation. You can't consent to human trafficking. So just disabuse yourself of that notion. Age is relevant on the issue of sentencing, and also on the issue of, exploitation and facilitating exploitation. But remember, adult women cannot consent to human trafficking. There are increased penalties for trafficking persons under the age of 18. And just briefly to touch on what Jeff was saying with respect to sentencing, sentencing is not a science. There is not A plus B equals the sentence. The sentencing judge looks at the circumstances of the offense and the circumstances of the offender. With human trafficking cases, you should expect to receive a penitentiary sentence, but there's a lot of discretion in terms of the sentences that judges impose. Going back, though, to the Supreme Court of Canada in Friesen, that is a wonderful case. And it's a case that everyone is familiar with in the court system now. And every time we're talking about child sex abuse, the Crown will be referencing Friesen, because the Supreme Court has been clear, sentences need to increase. So, you know, I would expect in a human trafficking case, regardless of whether or not a mandatory minimum sentence is at play, because sometimes there's challenges to those, you should expect a penitentiary sentence. But again, there's a lot of latitude in there in terms of this, because the court needs to also take into account the trafficker and what are their personal circumstances, what's their background, and what's their prospect of rehabilitation. And there is concern, depending on the age of the trafficker, what kind of sentencing would be imposed? When would it become a crushing sentence? So it's really nuanced, but the good news is the sentences are increasing. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Dawson.
Awesome. No, thank you for your insight. I appreciate that, especially, again, guys, please feel free. We will happily reference that that court case in the information that we send out after the fact. Please don't ever stop looking into these things, because it is very important, especially as stakeholders. I'm sure this is going to be echoed down the road, but please make sure that we never stop looking for information when it comes to this stuff, especially when it comes to being put forward. Deb, from Victim Services, what would your perspective be when it comes to the more concerning issues that you're seeing when it comes to human trafficking and some of the associated processes today?
I think one of the things we feel or run into is that it's difficult to have human trafficking charges laid, that many times it gets captured more under domestic violence or sexual assault. And then proving the coercion and controlling aspects of HT can be a challenge for detectives to substantiate. So I think that's part of one of the legal challenges. But the survivor's willingness to come forward, I'm kind of echoing what Dave said, is it's a daunting task to make a statement and potentially face court. And when you're already under potentially the Romeo guise of believing this person loves you, it's even more difficult that you feel that you're turning on the person that's caring for you. So it's challenging to get people to make their statement and then actually go through the court proceedings when there's no guarantee that there's going to be a consequence. Like we've talked about, that the consequences look differently or the wins look differently. But with that being said, that's partly why Victim Services can still support victims without there needing to be criminal charges laid or court proceedings in place. We just need someone to indicate that this is what's happened to them, and we can offer those supports without having to have all that other stuff happen for them to get that. So I just wanted to make that plug in there to remind our stakeholders.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, coming back, sorry to keep everybody waiting. Jeff, with this same question, same perspective, what are some of the issues that you're currently seeing right now, some of the challenges, and what's some of the associated processes that we might be seeing along the way as well?
Yeah, I think everybody on the panel's done a good job of capturing a lot of the challenges here. I'll maybe piggyback off a couple of them. You can't consent to human trafficking, as Liz said. What you can do is you can be an independent sex trade worker. That's not illegal. So the criminal code changed a number of years ago now, and generally when I'm speaking about females, but it's females, males, transgender. They can be sex trade workers of their own volition. They can advertise themselves. They can sell their own sex. They can get monetary benefits or material benefits off that. None of that is illegal. When this becomes illegal is when there's a criminal offense, is when someone else is benefiting off those. And then, of course, there's through the code, it tells us when it becomes human trafficking or such. And a challenge or an issue that we see a lot of times is the traffickers will have still instilled in their victims that it is illegal. So a lot of times we'll go and have contact with the sex trade worker, and they'll be scared to tell us anything because they've been groomed and told that the moment they give a statement, they're going to be arrested. They're going to be the ones that are in trouble, and they're the ones, not the trafficker. They'll convince them that they've done nothing. All they're doing. So that's a major issue for sure, getting over that hurdle. And I think that that's something that support, our stakeholders who are with us today. And I think that's something that could be a takeaway here, is make sure that they know it's not illegal to be a sex trade worker. It's illegal for someone else to benefit off their sex trade work. Other things that we're seeing right now is, again, with technology and through court cases. Not only do we learn through court cases, bad guys learn through court cases. So a lot of e-transfers now instead of your typical cash transaction, which is causing some different issues, including for police to be able to reach out through vice probes. We're seeing the offenses that muddy the waters a little bit in terms of frauds. So there's with the e-transfers, the sex trade worker or the trafficker will request, instead of cash payment, they'll want an e-transfer up front, and then the John will attend for his date, and there'll be obviously no transaction there. So a couple things on this. It's strange to me, but you can't communicate for the purpose. So you can be a sex trade worker, but really it's against the law to communicate with somebody for that sexual purpose. And even though a John can't communicate for a sexual purpose, when they're sending these e-transfers and getting ripped off, we are seeing them now call the police to report these things. With that, what's kind of taken that to the next level, and a trend that seems to be happening, we haven't seen it, at least I haven't seen it in Perth, in Stratford, but in the major centers right now, there's a trend where they're also being asked, the Johns that is, for a picture of their driver's license, and it's under the guise of safety. The sex trade worker is being told by their trafficker that to get pictures for them, and either beforehand or kind of at the door, and then they're extorting the John for saying that they now have his address. They're going to go to his family and expose him unless they pay more and more amounts of money. So that doesn't take the issue of helping sex trade workers away, obviously, but it does make things more difficult. We're talking, I think the latest facts I saw was this is a $99 billion a year industry, and the criminals are finding more and more ways to squeeze more dollars out of that, and that's, so we're going to see more and different kinds of criminal offenses, I think, pair with it, which again, I'm not trying to diminish the sex trade worker as being a victim, but it does make things more difficult.
Thanks very much for that. We did have a couple of follow-up questions that have come just out of the last couple of responses. We have a question, and again, I'll open this up to anybody who wants to answer it. Both the lack of services for mental health and seeing a client heading down the path that we're seeing, how do we support these potential victims? Does anybody want to speak to that in specifics?
I can speak to it from a victim services perspective in regards to if you see someone following down a path that may be leading them into difficulties, making referral to us so that we can have a meeting to discuss safety, discuss it more point blank of what we do and who we can refer to, and start to help guide them to supports that might get them on a better path. Also still recognizing it's client-centered approach and where the client wants to be and where the client wants to go. We need to respect that, but pointing out the safety factors and the risk factors of those behaviors. It's, the soft handoff. Let me introduce you to my friends at Victim Services. They deal with people that might have had similar situations like yours, and they might be able to give you some advice or some guidance or something along those lines. So I think reach out to your stakeholders that whatever path you think they may be going, if it's down a criminal path, reach out to your friends at OPP in respects to they could, have a conversation with the person about guiding them what their risk factors are, or my friends if they're victimization path, and my friends at Victim Services, those type, like reach out to your stakeholders. If you don't have the answer or struggling to where to refer those people, reach out to other sites, and they may not, but it's worth a shot of looking at who else can do what.
And I think this really does speak to that idea of that culture of shared responsibility that we talked about a little bit earlier on, where if everybody buys in, if there's a little bit of, we're not all able to solve every problem. That'd be crazy to think that we could, but in working collectively and communicating on through that network of stakeholders that we do have, we all have somebody that can do some piece of the puzzle, and it's our job to kind of come together to try and find those supports. Again, budgets are hard lines, but that doesn't mean that we can't connect them to somebody else, or we can't find another service or find another way to get the person the support that they need so that they can come out the other side of this situation a little bit better. We did have another follow-up question, and this one is specifically for Elizabeth. Could you speak to the complexity of prosecuting a bottom or a bottom bitch, and when it comes to recruiting or trafficking, or something that maybe not specifically for your case, but that a Crown might take into account when looking at these situations?
So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question in the way they were hoping, so I'll just do my best. A bottom, I want to just say this in the right way. Maybe this can go back to Jeff's point about getting the bad guys, right? And the handbook on getting the bad guys. And in a world of black and white, where you can say, that's a bad guy, that's a good guy, we're going to bring the hammer down on the bad guys, we're going to protect the good guys. I mean, our jobs would be a lot simpler. It can be challenging when the person you're prosecuting is also a victim of human trafficking. And in a situation where they are likely being coerced, likely being exploited, likely being, in some situations, abused themselves. And that creates a really difficult situation as a prosecutor, because there's no easy answer in terms of what to do by way of sentencing. And so that can be complicated. It can also be complicated, like Jeff referenced before, in terms of actually receiving information in order to successfully prosecute a bottom. I haven't been involved myself in the prosecution of a bottom, to be frank, so there's really limited insight I can provide. But even when we talk about some traffickers, I mean, they bring with them their own personal experiences as well. And again, in that black and white world where there's the bad guys and the good guys, it's a lot easier than the actual gray world that we live in, where it's really complicated in terms of people's personal backgrounds and how some people can get involved in the sex trade and how others can get involved as traffickers. So I think for me, that would be the challenging piece. And then going back to what Jeff had to say in terms of the actual ability to obtain records and to actually prove, who's actually steering the ship here and who's giving the direction and where the direction is coming from, I would see that as challenging. So hopefully that answered your question.
I think that's a great answer. I appreciate you fielding that. So we do want to change gears just a little bit. Oh, sorry, I just have one more question that's come in here. So I might actually be able to speak to this one. We received a question. We've talked about females being victims. Is there male victims as well? Basically is the gist of the question. We are seeing a lot of human trafficking cases, again, that hits a specific population. When we look statistically at it, the folks that walk through victim services doors, the folks that are involved in court proceedings, they predominantly are that younger female demographic. With that being said, that does not make it exclusive. There are a number of different individuals that come from very different backgrounds, different ages. Again, I've seen anything from 6 to 60 when it comes to human trafficking and exploitation, whether it's male, female, or anybody in between or indifferent. We're very quickly finding that there are people who identify in a lot of different ways, and they are victimized or open to victimization. Human trafficking does not discriminate. It does happen with male victims as well, but the majority that we do see statistically at this point are female victims. That doesn't mean that it's not happening to males. It just might happen in different ways, might not be recorded the same way. But again, the majority of victims that we are seeing are fitting a specific younger female age demographic. But with that being said, that doesn't mean it's exclusive to that age group or that gender. The next question that
I just been on quick. The other thing that I think is true about male victims. So usually when we see these sites, etc., it's gay males who are seeking out male services, and those victims are reluctant to come forward. So it's hard enough to get any victim to come forward, but we do find, from speaking with males who are in the sex trade, that they are very reluctant to come forward. So even more so.
Awesome. Thank you. I do want to change gears. The next question is something that I hope that every stakeholder that's on this call today takes away from this. And I think it's something that offers a huge amount of perspective, especially from the justice lens. And I call this question the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's 3 different things. And what I'm going to ask is that, Dave, if we could start with you, what's one thing that a stakeholder can do to positively impact a situation that might involve human trafficking? What's one thing that we think might be helpful as stakeholders that we're doing currently that it actually isn't helpful, it might actually be harmful to a situation? And what's that one thing that if you could tell us to steer clear as stakeholders during a human trafficking situation or while working with survivors of human trafficking, what's the one good thing that we can do? What's the one thing that might be harmful? And what's that one bad thing that we need to steer clear of no matter what?
I think for my answer, I'm going to focus on one thing specifically, and that is inadvertently lying. Telling somebody that we can call the police right now, they will send out an officer, and that you can talk to that officer immediately. And if you want, that officer can be a male, female, whatever you need them to be, might not be the truth. And when you lead off with that, and then the police, due to not having a female officer available, not having an officer available at that moment, and having to schedule something later, leads to doubt, leads to believing that they've been misled, and might lead to that interaction not being positive. So I think if you're just honest and you say, I don't know, but let's walk through this together. Let's figure out the answer together. Let's make the phone call. Let's get where we're going. That's the best way to go through this. It's not that anybody is purposely lying. It's this inadvertently, you're saying something, hoping that you're going to convince them to continue through. And in the end, you break that trust that you may have built up with them and cause them to go in a different direction or not follow through at that time.
That's a phenomenal answer. That is something that I think from every perspective, the inadvertent inability to give somebody an answer, we all want to solve the problem. It's absolutely massive. Jeff, same question for you. If there was one thing that was, give me one thing that's great that you wish everybody did, one thing that they might do that might be a little bit harmful when they're not intending it for it to, and one thing we should absolutely be steering clear of as a stakeholder.
So I'm going to echo some of Dave's points. First of all, everyone on this call, from what I can see, is someone who wants to help, right? We've dedicated our lives to being in a sector where we want to give assistance to people. Humanity matters to us. And when it comes to human trafficking, you know, it's easy to become passionate about this cause because it's awful, and we can see that it affects youth and that the trauma that would come from this. So recognizing that sometimes, including myself, gets us into trouble in trying to do more than what we actually can in our roles. So I think it's important that we recognize what our role is whenever that person comes forward. So whether you're a CAS worker, whether you're an addictions counselor, mental health counselor, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a police officer, whether you're the Crown, whether you're Vic Services. I think when a person comes to you who's a victim, recognize what your role is first and foremost, and support in that role. I heard someone on the panel earlier use the term "stay in your lane," which, you know, it's not. That shouldn't be anything but a positive statement, because what we need to do is build consistency in our approach, that everybody through this process, because we're all going to have a part in being successful in helping this, in helping a victim with whatever they need. And again, prosecution's gravy. Criminal charges are gravy. Prosecution is gravy. It's really that assistance in getting them out of the lifestyle when they choose to do so. And I think that's key as well. It's when they choose to do so. Dave mentioned about telling them to get in front of police, and then about what police could do or can't do. I think it's important not to push or to rush the victim through this process. They'll speak when they're ready to speak. That may be never. It may be that day. It may be a week. We don't know. Don't rush it. Just support them. Let them know that you'll help. Still, know who you need to report things to. You can remain confidential and ask for assistance. That's fine. When it comes to the Victim Bill of Rights, which says that police or that a victim of a criminal offense can have, you know, same gender police officer interview them, things like that. We're well aware of the Victim Bill of Rights, and it's important. It's an important piece of legislature. However, that's something that I hear a lot come to me as an investigator, is the victims coming forward and they're saying, I was told I will get this. Well, that's the police officer's job in that situation, to find out what they need and do that. And sometimes we just can't, as Dave said, to echo his comments, we can't accommodate that. And there's actually, in the Victim Bill of Rights, that's set out that it's when we can accommodate things and when it's reasonable to do so. And it's not an absolute that certain things go in. And those are things that we need to worry about. And I would ask that that be something that everybody here keeps in the back of their mind, and doesn't make those promises that we can't keep, because trust is a big thing when it comes to victims of human trafficking. And Deb mentioned earlier about replacing or finding that safe space, replacing that safe space so they can come forward. If we're breaking that trust right away by saying, well, we can't accommodate that, there's another uphill battle, right? They've already been told that police are bad and that the system's bad and it's working against them. So I would echo that. Those are my thoughts, is if we all work together on those things, I think we'll be successful in helping.
Awesome. Deb, from your perspective, when it comes to what's one thing that we should be looking at to do positively to impact a human trafficking situation? One thing that we're doing right now that might actually be a little bit harmful, and what is that absolute no-go? Where is our steer clear line?
I feel like I'm a broken record. We're repeating some of the stuff that was said, but to me, the biggest positive is know your stakeholders. To be able to do that soft handoff, know who it is you're reaching out to. You know, I have my friends at the shelter might be able to help us answer this, or my friends at victim services, or, you know, we know some of the OPP, let's see who's on today, let's see who we can talk with and chat with. But doing that soft entry into the reach out to community resources, I think, is important. And if you don't know who anybody is, they say, you know, actually, I don't know them. Well, let's find out together. Let's do that and walk that path with them. And so they're not alone. And if you can smooth it out a little bit by knowing someone or knowing some names or knowing the people that you're talking to, and kind of shoot the shit, for lack of a better word, before you're like, hey, how's it going? Like, and make it a little more comfortable. That can go a long way. The potential harm, I feel, comes into when we make promises that we can't keep, or even if we allude to it, because recipients are going to hear what they want to hear. There is a trauma brain, and Liz touched on some of that with the impact of their previous trauma, and their retention might not be, or comprehension might not be the same as what you're saying, but what they want to hear. Seem to be very clear and concise in what you can and cannot do, and what is a maybe and what isn't. Like, when you get into those muckier areas, it leaves it open to interpretation, and they may hear promises that you're not trying to make, but that they may hear it as such. So just be really mindful of how you're wording things. And my biggest steer clear would be assuming that you know what the client needs. So be mindful of your unconscious bias and assumptions based on past involvement, either with this client or with other clients that might have a similar story, because everyone's journey is unique and their pace for seeking support can change frequently. It's essential to go at the individual's pace and ensure you're hearing them for what they are asking for and what their needs are, not what you think they're going to need. So please steer clear of making assumptions and thinking we know them all because we've dealt with one other person that might have a similar story, that's what they did. It doesn't mean everybody else will walk the same path.
Awesome. Thank you. And Elizabeth, I apologize for making you go last on this one. I've kind of given them every opportunity to eat up as many of your talking points as possible. But from your perspective, you know, what are those kind of 3 points that we should be looking at? What's something really positive, something that actually might be a little bit harmful, and where is your steer clear point for stakeholders?
So no issue on my end. I hear that repetition helps retention. So I'm going to start with something that has been said now repeatedly. Harmful is pushing a victim into speaking to police when they're not ready to do that, and really with no idea of what that will unleash in terms of a police investigation and potentially a criminal court proceeding, potentially a trial proceeding. I'm not saying it's not important to encourage victims, and we should absolutely be encouraging them throughout the process, but we shouldn't be pushing. It's not about our agenda and what we want. It's about what the victim wants to do, and providing them with support and information so they can feel comfortable when they're ready to come forward to police. And, you know, I think everybody on this panel would agree that there should be more females in policing. We all agree on that. But what Jeff said is valuable. You know, we do our best with the resources that we have, and there are some very skilled male officers who do very great work with victims of human trafficking. And, you know, I don't want the idea of focusing on your role to be too strictly applied. I've seen officers frequently going above and beyond to assist victims. So going beyond their traditional role as an officer, but doing what they can to make a victim comfortable through the court process. And so, you know, there's nothing preventing us from going above and beyond in terms of supporting victims, but we do each have a separate role in supporting victims. So I would steer clear of pushing, and also imposing your values, your judgment, your sense of morality on a victim. They can smell it. They can smell it. You need to be real with victims. It's not about what you think is right or wrong. It's not about what you think should happen. Again, it's about supporting, empowering, providing information so that they can make decisions. You can't lift a victim up when you're looking down your nose at them. You need to be real with them and supportive consistently and fervently, but understanding, you know, the limitations of your role in the process. One thing I would encourage is thinking about independent legal advice for victims. So Kelly Beal is a former Crown attorney, former prosecutor, who provides free legal advice to victims of human trafficking. There are no time limits associated with her conversations with victims. There's no criteria, there are no fees, and it's an opportunity for a victim to very confidentially speak to a lawyer. So I, as a prosecutor, I cannot provide independent legal advice to a victim, but there are actually services available where a victim, without having to disclose to a worker, without having to disclose to CMHA, without having to disclose to anyone, can actually pick up a phone and call and get independent legal advice from a lawyer. Who can have a very frank conversation with a victim about potential legal implications, other issues that they might want to discuss. Because it's not to say that every conversation I have with a victim is recorded verbatim for disclosure, but I am a Crown. So I do have a disclosure obligation when I'm interacting with a victim. Totally different in a situation where a victim is seeking independent legal advice on her own. So I would encourage you, we have Kelly Beal's number, Dawson. Yeah, I would encourage you to share that in terms of making that available to victims if they're looking to speak to a lawyer, because I do find victims generally, not in all cases, feel empowered when they feel like they have an opportunity to speak to their lawyer, not the Crown attorney, but a person who's representing their interests. So I would encourage that for sure.
Awesome. And just to clarify, we will send out Kelly's information with the package that's going out after this training. Again, if anybody has to duck out or has missed any piece of this, all of these questions are being recorded, so you can rewatch them and rehear about Kelly and what she might be able to offer. But we will send out some of that information as well. Just before we move on to the next question, there was two things that I wanted to hit on as well, and I think it's more echoing Jeff and Elizabeth, and Dave said it as well. I'm sure everyone on this panel has hit it on at some point. But as stakeholders, it's our job to find the best person for the role, right? When we look at the person who's able to help the most, whether they're male, female, white, blue, purple, or yellow, it does not matter. We're looking for the best person to set somebody up to be successful down the road. And that's where that soft handoff becomes really, really important. Again, I totally respect there's going to be cases that are individually isolated with this stuff, but we all have individuals who, if you work in housing, you're great at housing. Be an expert at housing and lend those housing services to everyone else. But also, it's okay not to not be an expert. When I approached every single person that's currently sitting on this panel today, because I respect their experience, where they came from, and the lens that they're able to bring to this, every single one of them said to me, I am not an expert. But they all bring these expertise or this knowledge to it because they're very, very good at what they do. When we look at this, we all are very good at what we do. It's about looping in those services and creating that wraparound approach that everybody's hit on so far. The next question that we had was, Dave, I'll go to you for the first answer on this one as well. If there's one thing that you can ensure that every single stakeholder does when they're interacting with someone who survived a human trafficking situation, what would it be? One thing that you wish a stakeholder would do?
Thank you. That's going to me first. This is another one. I didn't want to steal everybody else's answer, but I think just going to the same thing again, give control back to the victim or the complainant, allow them to be involved in and direct you where you need to go, looking at their issues and what is important to them at that moment. If they're dealing with a substance abuse issue, they might not be worried about what's going on and they're being taken advantage of, because that's where they're getting their drugs from. So you need to focus on what their individual issues are, and it's going to be different with every case. And know what you know what you don't know, and know where to look for the answers of what you don't know. So if I don't know how to support a victim, I'm going to victim services. If I don't know where to get housing for somebody, I'm going to victim services and the women's shelter. If I don't know what's going on in the legal realm, I'm contacting the Crown and I'm saying, what does this look like if we bring this to court? So know what you know, and if you don't know where to get those answers, and rely on those experts.
Awesome. Liz, I know that you just had to answer the question, but again, if I were to give you the same perspective, I think you already touched on it a little bit, but that one thing that you wish every stakeholder would do given these situations, if there was one big one, what would it be?
From a Crown perspective, refocusing on safety. Safety is the goal, not a conviction. And so, I know it's always very interesting to know what an outcome would look like in the criminal court process. I can tell you that most people are disappointed at the conclusion of a criminal court process, and more important is safety. And that should really be the focus when we're dealing with a victim of human trafficking.
Perfect. Thank you. Jeff, what about if you had one opportunity, one thing that you wish every stakeholder would do when it came to these situations?
Care. And I know we all care, but in these cases, you really have to care. And I heard earlier, I think on the last question, no judgment, and you can't have any. And it's sometimes difficult. We don't have to understand the lifestyle, but we have to understand that someone else is in that lifestyle, either of their own volition or they're being controlled to be in it. And however they got in that, you can't judge. And if you do, it's going to be really difficult for them to see all of us as stakeholders, because we're a team, and get them the help that they need when they're ready to receive it, which is the other point. So no judgment. When I'm down at OPC and I do a case study, I always leave on the same note of that case study, is that, and I mentioned it in my early, I think the first question, which this is a different kind of investigation for police. And you really have to be committed to the victim, to the survivor, because there's whatever vulnerability got them into this, they need to feel safe enough that a community, the stakeholder community, is going to fulfill those that vulnerability and keep them safe. And we all play a part in that. You don't have to know, to echo Dave, you don't have to know everything about this. You don't have to know how it's going to end. You don't have to know if there's going to be arrests and convictions. What you do need to know is that you're going to care about them. You're going to help assist them in any way you can to fulfill those needs. And if you're not prepared to do that, just recognize the signs and then get them to someone who can do those things. And if you do that with a caring heart, I think we're all winning.
Thank you. Deb, again, I gave everybody an opportunity to steal it.
The worst spot is going last because everything's been already said.
No, I want
My
to make sure.
comment is believe them, listen to what they're saying, and offer supports that can be fulfilled. And to echo everybody else's, but you don't have to know anything. Use that pathways tool. Like, we're going to give you a template to help guide where interventions are possible. So make use of that tool, but don't expect to know everything. You're muted, Dawson.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, guys. I knew that was going to happen at some point. We made it almost 3 hours in and haven't had a slip up yet when it comes to Zoom, but here we are. So at this point, I do want to open it up to everybody that's in the audience right now. Is there any questions for any of our panelists specifically, or anybody in generality that we might be able to answer at this point? Feel free to throw them into the question and answer box.
Can I add one more thing about advice? Don't stop learning. Keep going to opportunities like this and try to stay up to date, because the language changes, the recruit, all of it changes constantly. Like Jeff had talked about, that it was back pages and then it's Leo's list and then it's whatever other new site. So there's constantly, these people are not stupid. They know how to adapt and adjust to fly under the radar. So keep learning and be open to opportunities to expand your knowledge around the subject.
While we wait for a question, Dawson, can I just piggyback on the issue of language? Because I did mean to say this. At some point in time, looking for an opportunity to kind of shoehorn it in, but language matters, but your language matters too. And the language you're using really matters. There's power in it, and it can be uplifting, and it can be humiliating or minimizing or insensitive very quickly. You know, language not just in your interactions, which is important, and I think cases like Regina versus Barton teach us that as prosecutors, the language you're using in front of a jury and how you're referring to a victim and how you could be dehumanizing a victim. Your language in your records really matters. And it's, you know, your records, although they are private, applications can be brought in court for your records. So, you know, there are situations where I read records and I see words like, the victim was uncooperative. She refused to cooperate. She refused to do this. She refused to do that. And I just ask people just pause for a minute and think of a way of reframing that, because what she's doing is she's expressing reluctance. She's not being uncooperative. She's deciding that she's not prepared to provide a statement. And when you use language like that, I think it's more helpful down the road, because your records might come up in a proceeding 5 years down the road. There is no statute of limitations in terms of these cases. And you know, the victim might come to you several times before there is an investigation and a prosecution. There are legal rules in terms of accessing your records. I don't want to send a chilling effect to everyone to think that suddenly your records are going to be provided or disclosed in a prosecution. There's a whole separate process for access to records. But I just wanted to caution you, when you're describing a victim in your records, be fair in your language to that victim. And you know, sometimes wanting to ensure that you don't get in trouble down the road because you closed a file or you didn't take further actions, therefore you want to make it absolutely clear that it was the victim who refused to cooperate. Rethink that and try to use language like reluctant or not at this time or not prepared to, because literally that's what's happening. She's not prepared to. She's not ready to do that. So let's get her ready to do that.
Thank you for that. That's very important. It's a lot of things that we as stakeholders don't often consider. We're very quick to paint that picture when in reality, we need to be very aware of it. We did have a couple of questions that have just come in. The big one is that, are there specific social media sites that you're aware of that are worse than others when it comes to grooming victims? Not when it comes to procurement of services, but when it comes to folks being targeted. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can start off. So I think what we're looking for here is your Snapchats. So Snapchat, obviously big with the younger generation. There's more now in addition with that, but Instagram, Snapchat, not so much your Facebooks. That's for us older folk, as it turns out. But what they can happen, obviously on Snapchat, it can be private. They can get rid of it, which is big. It can be it disappears and it's gone forever, and hard to track. Instagram's a good one because a lot of younger people will leave everything open for public viewing, and then the trafficker or the recruiter, there's roles, will use those as phishing sites and just start sending messages, instant messages. So those are the big ones. There's other ones as well now too, out there that are becoming just as big, but I would say that Snapchat and Instagram are still probably the two most prominent.
Awesome, thank you. We did receive another question, and again, I'll put this out to absolutely everyone. What advice would you give to a worker who's trying to support a victim of human trafficking, but they're traveling along that corridor that we talked about, that 401 corridor, they're popping up in different locations, and they're never in one spot long enough to get services in place? Or as soon as they start services in that one place, they're moving on to another jurisdiction, they're crossing another boundary, creating a little bit of chaos potentially, and the need for them to tell their story again. How would you suggest, what advice would you give to that worker?
I can talk about on the police side of things. For the OPP, we recently started a joint task force on human trafficking, and it's West region, East region, Central region. So it takes a huge region of area and space, and working with the local municipal police forces, and they're sharing information so that that person doesn't have to tell that story again and again. It's that information shared among police forces. But it is a difficult thing. You know, you connect them to services and then they move to another spot. What I've found is beneficial is talking to that person and finding a home location for them where that is a parent that they're going to connect with on a regular basis, if that's something that's in place, or a friend that they're going to connect with on a regular basis, and kind of that be their home base, somebody that they're reaching out to. That's the best I can do. I don't know if there's other people that have more information.
Dave, can a worker call the police to make a report on behalf of the client, or does the client need to make the report? I'm just looking for a paper trail to try and, if this individual is being moved around, if somebody else reports, like CAS or somebody else, that they're concerned for their client.
Anybody can call and an investigation will be open. It doesn't mean that we'll automatically reach out to that person, but I've been involved in many investigations where there's concern for somebody's safety, and then we start, and that's where I've connected with human trafficking units in Ottawa, Toronto, Kitchener, all the way down, because they are moving along that corridor, and we're just working to try to see if they're okay and verify their well-being. And so it's great that there's a connection there, and you see where they're going and moving along, and all those different human trafficking units can put things in place so that if they see that name come up, they can connect with them and share that information.
And I would just encourage you to communicate, like we've said, with your colleagues. So, you know, I'm a Crown attorney here in Stratford. That doesn't prevent me from picking up the phone and calling a Crown attorney in Windsor, or a Crown attorney in Goderich, or my colleague in Woodstock, and communicate. So I suspect the same would apply if you're working with an organization where the person has geographically left your jurisdiction, but you can communicate with your colleague in the relevant jurisdiction and collaborate together to see how to problem solve this issue together. You know, we do have a regional human trafficking Crown for the region, just like police have a task force. And you know, I appreciate that there are kind of jurisdictional issues, but you know, at the same time, we need to push and realize that those jurisdictional issues don't apply to victims, right? And we need to work through those issues to ensure that victims are being supported, and victims should not have to tell their story over and over and over and over again. You know, ideally for me, a victim, when she provides a statement to police, she's providing one statement. She's not providing multiple statements to police and then, you know, having to kind of piece everything together. I mean, that sometimes that does happen, but we shouldn't be asking victims to discuss what's happened to them, to describe in detail the trauma that they've experienced more than is absolutely necessary. And the onus is on us to share information and to figure out how to reduce the number of times a victim has to reach out for services.
Awesome. Thank you guys all for your answers with that. It is quite a challenging piece, especially when we do have someone who's potentially transient in nature, and we are operating with those borders. So I do understand and can echo, you know, some of the sentiments when it comes to some of the challenges with that. But again, with that collaborative approach, that is really what matters. I do have a question here, and it's regarding consent. If they've declined collaboration or alternative services, and they're a client of human trafficking, there's kind of two different pieces to this, and I'll speak to one and then I'll open it up to everybody else. We had talked initially about understanding that we don't necessarily know what's right for that client in that moment. It is not our job to impose what we believe to be best, or to direct or dictate what they should or shouldn't be doing, especially if they're declining consent when it comes to sharing information with services. The only thing that I would caution or make note of is that I understand that everyone has a duty to report, and consent is a very, very valuable thing. Safety is a huge piece as well, right? So as long as we can be aware of the safety of that individual and they are safe in that moment and we're not worried about that, then we really do need to be aware of what their choice is, what their best interests are, as long as we can guarantee their safety in that moment. Does anybody else have anything regarding if they were to decline collaboration? Again, maybe potentially police, if they're not willing to speak to police, what options might be there if they're not consenting in that moment?
Again, so when we do vice probes in the hotels, I would say 90+% of the sex trade workers, even if we know, like we can watch the trafficker walk out of the hotel room and they'll still deny any assistance, or they'll deny that they're being trafficked, or they'll just say that they're not ready to speak. That happens more than it doesn't here. Like I said, 90+% of the time. And that's okay. And that's where we're talking about not pushing. And it's just that consistent approach of being willing and patient to help when they're ready. As police, we have, I don't want to go into the ways that we have to try and keep contact in a couple different ways or provide ongoing support. Some of those are I think, privileged police practices that I don't want out, but it's a consistent message of when you're ready, here's what we can do for you. And it's frustrating because you think, why wouldn't someone want to get out, or why wouldn't someone want to go talk to an addictions counselor or whatever? But unless they're a child in need of protection, a lot of times we're just making sure that they have a positive interaction. And that's the same for stakeholders, a positive interaction, so that on that day when they decide they do want to speak, they're good to do it at that time. So it's a lot like domestic violence. We know that the statistics tell us that a domestic violence victim will have so many interactions with police before they're willing to give a statement. Human trafficking is the same. And we have to be okay with that. We just have to try and not get frustrated, stay positive, and be consistent in our messaging.
I want to point out too that stakeholders can have hypothetical conversations. So you could contact a service and say, hypothetically speaking, I have a client that might, and don't identify the client, and brainstorm through, if you have a relationship with that client and you can get information from our organization that you can share with that person and you can be the conduit, I think that that's suffice. And then work on getting that individual to be willing to actually talk to the service provider directly. But if they're not willing to do collaboration, you can have those collaborative conversations without identifying the client and then go back to your client with that information. So there's still a roundabout way of getting information to somebody, even if they don't want to do the direct collaboration. Not so much as far as charging and all that, like you can't collaborate around that, but around supports and referrals and those types of things, and ideas and suggestions or ways of approaching something, or things that would be helpful to say or not helpful to say, or like that's something that victim services across the province could help all stakeholders with. And I'm sure there's other, as in the shelter could with certain things, or like we said, addictions, know who your stakeholders are and have hypothetical, confidential conversations that aren't identifying the victim.
Awesome, thank you. We have one more question here that's come in. It's looking at the process by comparison for those that are under 16 or those that are identified as youth in our stakeholder system. How does that kind of differ from an adult situation or an individual in that case? And what can be any suggestions, any tips, any pieces for the things that might be unique to working with kids as opposed to, or those that are identified as youth in our system as opposed to adults, especially when it comes to human trafficking?
I guess I'll jump in. So in terms of, the provisions respecting human trafficking, we're talking about 18 and under, but I understand there's different rules for service providers where you get into, 16, 17, 18, and sorry, did I say under 18? Not 18 and under 18. But, the Victim Bill of Rights, for example, defines a victim as being the actual victim or a parent of the person within Section 1 of the Family Law Act. So, some of the rights of victims apply to parents as well in terms of, what information they can receive from, I'm talking about, the criminal court process. So there is information that I can share with a parent or with a statutory parent about a proceeding. Of course, I would never do that at the risk of the proceeding. I would never do it in a situation where I think it's going to alienate the victim, but just more so in a supportive way to encourage enough knowledge so that the parent can help support their child, but not going beyond, information that's meant to support the victim. I certainly, appreciate that victims do not want their parents present when they're testifying often, hearing what's happened, and I totally appreciate that. And so we're sensitive to that, but I just think keep in mind that, parents are entitled to, as far as the criminal court process goes under the Victim Bill of Rights, they are entitled to some information, and that includes statutory parents as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And I know that it is a very difficult challenge when it comes to working through age of consent and some of those pieces around service providers, not necessarily, obviously, it's already been touched on that their consent is a no factor when it comes to human trafficking. It's not possible, as Liz, Jeff, and I think everyone has voiced. That's a huge issue. When it comes to service provision, though, I think it is really important that we focus on some of the realities around, as long as we're doing everything we can to keep people safe. That is the first and foremost, especially when it comes to youth. I know that some of the duty to report comes into play as well for some people, but like Elizabeth mentioned there are factors that we will consider, especially when it comes to human trafficking, and everyone should consider in the best interest of the person that's been victimized. Is there any other questions at this point? I just want to make sure that we're giving everybody an opportunity to ask our panel while we have everybody here. Again, I appreciate everybody that's brought a question forward so far. I'm not seeing anything else coming through. If they do come through, great, we will answer them. But I do want to ask one final question of each of our panelists. As you leave here today, if you could leave the stakeholders in our region with one message regarding human trafficking, regarding everything that we've talked about today, what would it be? Elizabeth, we'll start with you. One final message.
I would just say thank you for your interest in human trafficking. It is a complicated area, but people who are willing to support victims of human trafficking, who are willing to, learn, who are willing to communicate with each other, that's the most we could ask for. We don't operate in a perfect system. We have our limits in what we're able to do and what we can't do, but generally speaking, the people that I've come across who have an interest in human trafficking cases go above and beyond, and I just appreciate the work that's being done and would encourage you to continue to communicate with your, often I refer to justice partners. I think it's even larger in this case to community stakeholders.
Thank you. Dave, same thing, a final message. If you had one more thing to share with the stakeholders today, what is it?
I think coming from a rural area, it's already been said, it's here, it's in all communities. It's not a big city problem. So being aware that it's here, keeping your eyes open, looking for it, looking for those opportunities to connect with people and have those positive interactions, I think is the biggest key to progress and seeing things forward. It's just knowing that it's in your areas and keeping an eye out for it.
Thanks so much. Jeff, same thing. If you had one last message for the folks that are on this call today.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me here. Appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for coming to this training. If my message would be, if something doesn't feel right, trust yourself. And, you know, you don't have to have all the answers. We have over 100 people, I think, on this call. Dawson, you were saying, hopefully that list goes out. We now have a network. Find someone who might know and lean on them and lean on each other to help the victim in the best way we can. Focus on that victim, focus on that survivor, how to provide them the necessities they need, safety, shelter, food, etc. And be kind to them, and don't push. Don't push. Let them know that when they're ready to talk, whenever that might be, someone will be there to listen.
Thank you. Deb, final thoughts, one more thing to send out?
Reach out to your local victim services. We're across the whole province. There's an office close by you. So if you need any support, guidance, advice, or don't let consent stop you from having a hypothetical conversation and running through those scenarios with your stakeholders that might have insight into being able to offer support. And I'm shamelessly plugging victim services across the province for that.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much again. I appreciate everybody taking the time today. Thank you very much to our panelists for their time today. Again, we appreciate the experience. We appreciate the viewpoints and everything that you shared with our stakeholders today. Thank you for giving your time. I know that you're all very busy, but we appreciate the insight, and thank you again for everything that you do in our community. And thank you for helping us to get better as a community when it comes to our knowledge around human trafficking and those processes about how we actually help somebody. So thank you guys so much for that. I appreciate it. Just going to share this one last time. So again, thank you to everybody that was involved today. We appreciate it. I know that we're about 20 minutes early, which is great because it means that everybody can grab their food a little bit early for lunchtime. But thank you to everybody who participated in today's session. We hope that it was helpful. If there are questions that come up after the fact, please feel free to shoot us an email, drop us a line, reach out. Again, I say 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. a day from now or a year from now, please reach out with your questions if you have them. We're here to help. It's our job to help. Collectively as a community, we all want to get better when it comes to human trafficking. We all want to be successful going forward, and we all want to do what's in the best interest of our clients. There will be a follow-up email that gets sent out with a recording from today's session with all of the questions that we talked about, all of the documents that we made reference to. Please feel free to share it. Please feel free to, if your coworkers were not able to make it, if you have a parent, sibling, your dog wants to watch this presentation again, please feel free to give it to them and show that to them. Please use the Pathways Safety document regionally, all of those pieces. We really appreciate everybody making the time to be available for today's session. And again, please stay tuned as well. We do have more community sessions coming up in the future on some other topics, things like theft and fraud, awareness and prevention, and risk assessment and management when it comes to dealing with potentially clients that might be in danger. Again, thank you guys so much for attending. This is Human Trafficking Advanced Edition 2022, made possible by the Central Huron Donation Fund. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.